Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 2141, A Plot. As Romeo lost himself in his thoughts, a small black dot suddenly flew in front of him. The black dot grew bigger as it approached him. When it got closer, it turned into a giant over 10,000 feet in height. This giant's wild god power was incomparably pure, and his body shone with a faint, golden light. The wild body of the Yellow Emperor. At that moment, Romeo increased his guard. He held the bamboo sword in one hand and slightly leaned forward, prepared to attack at any time. A layer of light golden color would wash over the bodies of the wild gods from the Yellow Emperor race when their blood was activated. Thus, Romeo thought that the one who arrived must have the blood of the Yellow Emperor race. You've killed 8 wild gods in an instant. You really are worthy of your reputation as a new talent of the Nine Li race. The man from the Yellow Emperor race laughed. If you want to challenge me, so be it. Why did you send your useless followers to fight me? Romeo snorted. The man's lips curved up into a grin. I just wanted you to warm up. Since I let you in, of course I won't let you leave the immemorial wilderness. What do you mean? Romeo asked as his face darkened. It was true that the Nine Li race and the Yellow Emperor race had been fighting fiercely in the immemorial wilderness. The only thing was, most of those who had died were the outsiders who came to collect wild bones. It didn't matter if they received the admission tokens of the Nine Li race or the Yellow Emperor race, because the core disciples of the two races eventually killed them as they were just collateral damage from the core disciples' cultivation. The core disciples of the two races, however, rarely fought in real fights. They even deliberately avoided too many conflicts. After all, most of the core disciples were cultivated by consuming a great amount of blood wild bones. The death of any core disciple would bring a great loss. Just then, Romeo had a bad feeling about the man's words. On the other hand, the man thought that Romeo wouldn't be able to live anymore. It's very simple. We've been fighting for the Sky South Bone Tower so long. It's time for our race to settle in, he said with a chuckle. You think you can settle in if you kill me? It won't be that simple, Romeo sneered. It couldn't be denied that the competition in their world was too fierce. Moreover, the powerhouses of all the clans were present in the list of blood lineage. Ranked first place was the Snake Goddess race, followed by the Yellow Emperor race and the Nine Li race, respectively. Aside from those three, there were other large races as well. When shepherds quarreled, the wolf had a winning game, as the saying went. If the Yellow Emperor race and the Nine Li race really fought over the Sky South Bone Tower, the other races would most likely take advantage of the opportunity, and that was the last thing the two races wanted to happen. Therefore, they really couldn't go all out to fight over the Sky South Bone Tower. Besides, even if the Yellow Emperor race killed Romeo, they still wouldn't be able to settle in the Sky South Bone Tower either. Of course we can. As long as we kill a few of the core disciples from the younger generation of your race, we will be able to win back the Sky South Bone Tower. Ha ha ha, the man said and laughed. What do you mean? Romeo growled. Although you are a disciple of the Nine Li race, I'm afraid you don't know that our races have made a bet. Mid-rank wild gods will fight at the foot of the Sky South Bone Tower, and the winners will be able to settle in the tower. It's said that each race can dispatch 5 people to the match. Among the younger generation of your race, Chandler is ranked 2nd, and Farhan is ranked 4th, but unfortunately, both of them are dead and can't participate in the match. You are ranked 3rd, but you'd probably die too. Ha ha, the man cackled. Suddenly, 2 more black dots approached them as the man laughed wildly. The 2 black dots quickly increased in size and turned into 2 wild gods who were over 10,000 feet tall. Their bodies also sparkled with a golden light, which meant that they were also from Yellow Emperor race. Now, Romeo couldn't help but be surprised at the man's words. He glared at him and asked, "Did you kill Farhan and Chandler?" The most talented people from the younger generation of the Nine Li race were Elsa, Chandler, Romeo, Farhan, and Killian. Chandler and Romeo were the closest ones among them, and they often trained in the immemorial wilderness. If what the man had said was true, then he really did kill Chandler. That was something that Romeo had never expected. At the same time, he understood what the man meant. As soon as the two races had made a bet, the Yellow Emperor race quickly killed the 2 out of the top 5 young warriors of the 9 Li race. In that case, the Yellow Emperor race had gained the initiative. Of course, the fewer young talents the 9 Li race had, the Yellow Emperor race's chances of victory were greater. Chandler and Farhan were dead, and now they targeted Romeo. How evil, Romeo blurted out, and as soon as he realized that fact, the only thought in his mind was to escape. Whoosh, he immediately turned around and flew towards the other side of the immemorial wilderness. The man just snickered and said, "Since you're here, there's no way that I'll let you run away." As soon as he finished speaking, the 3 men from the Yellow Emperor race rushed to chase Romeo. Somewhere far away, Zen was oblivious to what was happening in that area of immemorial wilderness. He just wholeheartedly continued to dig the wild bones. After a few hours, he had accumulated more than 30,000 wild bones. If he worked with such efficiency and went to the immemorial wilderness a few times a month, he could have several 100,000 wild bones. No wonder these people were willing to take the risk to enter this place. The efficiency of collecting wild bones in this way was countless times higher. Just by absorbing more than 30,000 wild bones alone would be able to increase his body to 1,000 feet high. What if he came to collect wild bones for a month? When Zen released his spiritual sense again, he felt something different and his heart beat slightly faster. What? He had clearly sensed that a wild bone underneath the ground gave off a special kind of power. It's a blood wild bone. He had seen a blood wild bone before and knew that the auras of different blood wild bones were different. Whoosh, he wasted no time and his body began to dig down in a flash. The blood wild bone wasn't buried too deep. It was only about 20 feet underground. It wasn't long before he was 20 feet deep. He carefully removed the skeletons and pulled out a piece of brown wild bone. The aura of this wild bone. The moment he touched it, he was hit with something familiar. Does it have Chiyu's blood? He muttered. The mere thought of it quickly made him excited. He had Chiyu's blood, but there were too few blood wild bones in the world. He didn't get the second one after he dug out one blood wild bone, let alone the one with Chiyu's blood. Despite being thrilled for words, he gently moved his hand along the surface of the wild bone and used his spiritual sense to draw out a wisp of the wild god power. Swish. In turn, the wisp of the brown wild god power quietly transformed into the shape of 3 heads and 6 arms. Chapter 2142, Ignored. This wasn't the first time Zen had seen something with 3 heads and 6 arms. The shadow formed by the stream of brown wild god power was obscure, but Zen was certain that this wild bone contained Chiyu's bloodline. Finding this wild bone was a good thing, but Zen still had some concerns. Back in the evolutionary universe, he changed his blood in order to avoid being punished by the ruling slate. He didn't know if doing so would also affect his absorption of the blood wild bone's power. The only way to find out was to give it a try. It was not suitable to refine the wild god power in the immemorial wilderness, so Zen had to put away this blood wild bone in his space ring for the meantime. At that moment, he heard a clamor of footsteps approaching. Zen jumped from the hole and saw smoke billowing in the distance. At the same time, he saw countless whites running away from the smoke. These whites were on all fours and were currently rushing towards Zen at a surprisingly fast rate. These whites, are they crazy? Sarah exclaimed, her face filled with astonishment as she watched this scene. The wild gods who often explored the immemorial wilderness knew of the large number of whites that resided here. Once, the entire population of whites was wiped out by a great force. Not long after, a large number of whites appeared in the immemorial wilderness all over again. There was simply no way of getting rid of them. The strangest thing was that nobody knew where these whites came from. Fortunately, the strength of these creatures was ordinary and not much of a threat against the wild gods. However, seeing them rush over in such large numbers was strange. Something must be wrong. Get out of here, all of you, Hiram shouted, waving his 1,000-foot-long rake. Phew, the rake hit hundreds of whites, turning them into broken corpses. This bloody scene made Zen frown. He did not feel any ill intent from these whites. On the contrary, it seemed as if they were merely escaping from something. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, a figure, 10,000 feet long, appeared in the smoke. The figure moved across the smoke and fell towards Zen. It was a huge giant, equivalent to a huge mountain, and it was about to crash down upon him. Zen's eyes were wide open. He soared into the air and narrowly avoided the giant. Rumble. The giant smashed onto the ground and glided quite a distance, leaving a ditch that was 1,000 feet deep in his wake. It is Romeo. Zen hovered in the sky and clearly saw the giant's features. It had 2 giant heads and 4 arms, but the 2 faces were the same as Romeo's. However, Romeo's huge body was currently covered in scars. Is it actually Romeo? Sarah asked, eyes still filled with shock. Who has such a huge amount of strength to hurt Romeo? Hiram mused, his eyes widened in astonishment. Amos's face also darkened as he looked at the billowing smoke in the distance. He could make out 3 huge figures, each one over 10,000 feet tall. As the figures emerged from the smoke, they saw that they were 3 giants that glowed with golden light. At that moment, Amos's, Sarah's, and Hiram's faces all paled. They had been digging for wild bones in this area for years and knew well enough that this golden light was a special bloodline Thurgi of the Yellow Emperor race. Amos had been so careful in avoiding these powerful warriors since they had already killed a countless number of wild gods. Romeo was badly injured upon fighting all these 3 great opponents. If they were to get involved, they would definitely die. Give up, Romeo, you won't escape this immemorial wilderness this time, the middle-aged man at the helm announced. Romeo was on the ground, but he stood up and wiped the blood off the corner of his mouth. Do you not fear the 9 race? Do you not fear us waging a war? The middle-aged man burst into laughter. War? It seems you've overestimated yourself, Romeo. You're only one of the many mid-rank wild gods in the 9 race. Do you honestly think they'll wage a war because of you? The situation of the world right now was extremely delicate. Aside from the snake goddess race, the Yellow Emperor race, and the 9 race, the Emperor Charm race was also eager to make its move. The strong warriors of each race hid in the bone towers and rarely caused any commotion. Romeo was indeed an outstanding warrior, but his death was not enough to warrant a declaration of war from the 9 race. Moreover, this area of the immemorial wilderness was the training ground for the 9 races and the Yellow Emperor race's warriors. Dying here was very common. When Romeo heard this, his eyes showed a trace of despair. It seemed he was fated to die here. The middle-aged man's face was filled with confidence in his victory. He swept his gaze over Zen and the others. Amos, Sarah, and Hiram all trembled in fear. They wanted to find an opportunity to run away and were unwilling to get involved in the dispute between the 2 races. Would they let them go? Zen firmly stood in midair, pondering the situation. He didn't know the 9 race's origin, but he thought of the golden Chiyu statue in the Palace of the Sun and assumed that Romeo and he should belong to the same race. If he saved Romeo, that meant getting the chance of probably joining the 9 race. However, the strength of the 3 wild gods of the Yellow Emperor race was great, and it would mean taking a great risk to fight them. Bilal, you go and kill those irrelevant vermin. Tyreek and I will finish off Romeo, the middle-aged man instructed. As soon as he said this, Amos, Sarah, and Hiram understood that they had been handed down their death sentences. However, they weren't going to sit here and wait to get killed. The 3 of them quickly rose in size, turning into 7,000 or 8,000 feet tall giants. They were going to go all out to fight for their lives. Zen still hadn't activated his wild god power. He, instead, used chaotic energy to send Romeo, Sarah, Hiram, and Amos a voice message. Romeo, try to delay those 2 men while I suppress Bilal with soul force. The rest of you, work together and kill him. As long as we eliminate one of them, everything will be easier. A strange expression appeared on everyone's face when they heard Zen's voice. Most of the warriors in this world mainly cultivated wild god power, largely because of the environment they were in. Because of this, all wild gods had one shortcoming: their souls weren't strong enough. Fortunately, everyone's soul was about at the same level, so it wasn't a determining factor in fighting against their opponents. When Zen told them that he intended to suppress Bilal with his soul force, they couldn't believe their ears. However, there was no time to think about it. The middle-aged man and Tyreek were already rushing towards Romeo. Without so much as a thought, Romeo chose to retreat. At the same time, Bilal also rushed towards Hiram like a strong beast, face red with excitement. Zen, who still hadn't activated his wild god power, was ignored by Bilal as if he was a mere mosquito. Taking advantage of this, Zen flew high up into the air. He narrowed his eyes and 2 rays of light on the shadow-bearing sword began to flash. He sent a message through his chaotic energy once again. Now is the time. Attack. Chapter 2143, Take Action in Person. Hiram, Sarah, and Amos could change into 8,000 feet tall giants and were regarded as mid-rank wild gods. However, there was a huge difference between their strength and that of a wild god with a bloodline. They would be the ones to get killed. Hiram was considered a brave warrior. He clenched his teeth and held onto his rake, standing still despite the oncoming attack of Bilal from the Yellow Emperor race. Amos looked as if he was prepared to fight to the death, but he actually kept a safe distance and was always prepared to turn tail if things went south. Hiram didn't think much after hearing Zen's words. He opened his mouth and let out a roar, activating the wild god power in his body as he jumped up and slashed his rake towards Bilal. At the same time, Sarah's figure flashed past the other side, armed with a short sword. Despite her weapon being a short sword, it should be considered that the one who wielded it was about 8,000 feet tall, which made the sword more than 1,000 feet long. "Are you guys seriously resisting?" "Ha ha," Bilal mocked. The Yellow Emperor race regarded these wild gods as mere target practice. Bilal thought of them as nothing more than dirt, so he didn't really take them seriously. His entire body flashed with golden light and he stretched out his thick, right hand to directly snatch Hiram's rake. Zen's eyes flashed, frenzy of goodwill and malice. As he shouted, his strong soul force activated the shadow-bearing sword. This soul attack with the truth of godly way rushed towards Bilal. Bang! Bilal felt as if his head had been hit by a heavy hammer and was immediately dazed. He was totally confused and ended up standing in place like a fool. "I'll hit you to death." Hiram knew he had to take advantage of this and tried to also hit Bilal. He didn't know how Zen did it but knew it was his opening. The huge rake came smashing down towards Bilal. Clang! The rake came crashing down on Bilal's head with a crisp sound. They saw how the golden light above him released bursts of glistening light waves that successfully blocked Hiram's extremely powerful attack. Go to perdition! Sarah, who was at the side, also swung her short sword and struck it into Bilal's rib. Crack! Unfortunately, the golden light around Bilal served as impenetrable armor. The short sword, sharp as it was, failed to pierce Bilal's body. With a reluctant expression on her face, Sarah turned and once again stabbed the short sword towards Bilal. Whizzing, whizzing, her attacks were aimed at his vital parts but were blocked by the golden light each time. Hiram had also taken this time to repeatedly smash Bilal's head with his rake several times, but he still couldn't break through the golden light. On the other side, Romeo continued to dodge his pursuers. The sight of his allies unable to land a blow on Bilal caused him great anxiety. He was initially surprised at Zen's abilities, but it seemed that the other wild gods weren't even able to break Bilal's Yellow Emperor wild body. This was truly a waste of opportunity. Unfortunately, he was currently in a tight spot and couldn't help them kill Bilal. Zen's soul attack messed Bilal's mind for a moment. He had to spend a few moments in a daze before regaining consciousness and, when he did, his huge face was immediately distorted in anger. To think that he was a member of the Yellow Emperor race and yet was actually caught off guard by these weak wild gods was laughable. If it weren't for the defensive power of his Yellow Emperor wild body, he would have already died. Swish! Bilal reached out and took Hiram's rake with one hand and grabbed Sarah's neck with the other. The wild god power burst out from his body as he lifted Sarah off the ground. "You are just a woman. But you are very bold," he said with a vicious smile. Sarah clawed at his hand, unable to say a word against him. Seeing this, Zen's thin figure quietly floated in Bilal's mind. At that moment, an inaudible voice spoke to his ear. "Alas, they can't defeat you after attacking for so long. In the end, I have to take action in person." Bilal frowned, only realizing then that Zen still hadn't activated the wild god power. The young man was merely floating around like a mosquito the entire time. Bilal briefly wondered if it was he who released the soul attack. It was then that a unique aura emerged. Bang! Another huge, invisible hammer hit his head, disorienting his soul. Zen held the hilt of the shadow-bearing sword on one hand and cradled the blade with the other. The aura of hundreds of godly ways merged in his inner world once again. Ways blending strike, chop. Zen was a mere mosquito compared to Bilal. Despite the golden light produced by the Ways blending strike being 1,000 feet long, it was only a mere thread compared to Bilal's huge body. However, just as this crescent-shaped thread touched the golden light around Bilal, it suddenly let out a harsh noise. Sizz, sizz, the golden light around Bilal grew brighter and flashed crazily, as if it was finally ready to collapse. As the thin thread continued to cut forward, a crisp, smashing sound was heard. The golden light around Bilal finally collapsed and the thread pierced through his neck. Zen didn't even bother to check if his attack killed Bilal or not and instead floated directly to Romeo. He didn't really want to use the Ways blending strike in front of others, which was the main reason why he hoped Hiram and Sarah could have been enough to help him kill Bilal. However, he didn't expect the gap between ordinary wild gods and a wild god with a bloodline to be so big. Bilal was already just standing there, yet the two of them could do nothing. Zen had no choice but to intervene. Noticing that the hand that grabbed her neck lost its strength, Sarah immediately struggled and threw Bilal's arm off her. She retreated a few steps back and stared at her foe. Hiram and Amos were also stunned. Not long after, blood spilled out of Bilal's neck. His huge head began to tilt until it eventually fell off cleanly from his torso. Only then did they realize that Zen had succeeded in what they failed to do. He didn't even turn into the form of a wild god. Well, that guy doesn't depend on the wild god power at all, Hiram remarked excitedly. Sarah was calmer now and couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. She looked at Zen with complex emotions. I haven't heard of a true god that possesses such powerful strength. Amos couldn't help but gasp in surprise. It was only then that he realized that Zen stabbed the sword into his neck not because of his carelessness. It was only because Zen showed him mercy that he was still alive and breathing. Chapter 2144, Cooperation. Facing the overwhelming forces in the attack of both the middle-aged man and Tyreek of the Yellow Emperor race, Romeo was left with no choice but to retreat. Bang! Rallying the golden glow on the surface of his body, the middle-aged man delivered a stunning series of punches to Romeo's head. Bang! 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 Romeo staggered back 7 or 8 steps in the onslaught, and with every step he took, a huge crater formed in the ground. The immemorial wilderness began to shake violently as cataclysmic forces were at work. As soon as he had balanced his body, Tyreek charged in closely behind. Fortunately, Romeo had 4 hands. He clasped the bamboo sword in one hand and swung it with tremendous force. An emerald green sword radiance spewed forth to block Tyreek. Tyreek knew fear at the sight of this emerald green sword light. This was probably the only force that could penetrate the Yellow Emperor wild body, so he tried his best to avoid it. However, just as Tyreek was forced to back off, the middle-aged man stepped up again. As the two tag-teamed in attacking Romeo, he almost had no way to fight back and could only defend himself desperately. He didn't even have a spare moment to glance at the battle that Zen was embroiled in. Just now, Zen had used the soul attack to disrupt Bilal's soul, which gave Romeo a glimmer of hope. It was a pity that the combined strength of the other 2 wild gods had proven too weak. They were unable to even dent Bilal's Yellow Emperor wild body. His only glimmer of hope died in the instant that it had been ignited. When Bilal finished off those wild gods and joined forces with the middle-aged man and Tyreek to attack him, he would surely perish today. Thinking of this, Romeo felt a pang of sorrow in his heart. He was unwilling to face death here in this immemorial wilderness. If he could only get some more blood wild bones, then he could even have a chance to become the top warrior among the younger generation. As despair set in, even his fighting spirit gradually began to weaken. Seeing the middle-aged man rush at him again, he even had a brief urge to simply give up resistance. Just then, a voice delivered by chaotic energy echoed into his ears again. Romeo, I'll disturb these two's minds, and you take the chance to vanquish them. What? Romeo's eyes flashed in surprise as he looked over and saw Zen, who was several thousand feet away. Zen still hadn't activated the wild god power. He hovered in the air like a small mosquito. He was utterly inconspicuous, but in Romeo's eyes, he had become a life-saving straw. Swish! Romeo clutched the sword tightly with renewed strength in one hand. Facing the violent attack of the middle-aged man, he swayed backward and placed one of his arms across his chest to block the attack. Bang! The punch from the middle-aged man landed on his shielding arm. Crack! The arm was immediately bent at a 90-degree angle. It had actually been broken by the sheer force of the middle-aged man's punch. The biggest advantage of the 9-Li wild body was that it could grow spare limbs, and it had the potential to grow 2 more heads and 4 more arms. The flesh of the body was far more solid than that of ordinary wild gods, and it could rapidly heal after being injured due to its immense vitality. In comparison, the Yellow Emperor wild body possessed extremely powerful defensive power. Romeo, who had now lost an arm, spun up into the air. The bamboo sword swept out over a distance of over 10,000 feet, forming a huge, glittering arc in the air. His sword swept down at Tyreek. Are you now going to risk your life? Unfortunately, your life is utterly worthless. It's a pity that none of you will leave here alive today. The middle-aged man laughed, a hollow and sinister sound. As Romeo slashed down at Tyreek with his sword, it presented a good chance for the middle-aged man to counterattack him. He had the ability to kill Romeo before Romeo's sword came into range of Tyreek. Tyreek sneered coldly. This Romeo fellow seemed to have truly given up the fight. It was impossible that this clumsy attack could even scratch him. But at the critical moment, both the middle-aged man and Tyreek suddenly sensed a violent flash of light expanding at the corners of their eyes. They narrowed their eyes to look, and they saw Zen, who was tiny as a mosquito. Romeo's foes were stunned. Neither the middle-aged man nor Tyreek had even guessed that Zen was still alive. After Bilal had attacked the others, they had assumed he would succeed, and they didn't bother to check the result. As a member of the Yellow Emperor race, it should have been a piece of cake for Bilal to finish off 4 mere wild gods. The moment they focused in on Zen, they were still unaware that Bilal had already died. Instead, they were stunned that Zen had even been able to escape from Bilal. However, just as this thought flashed through their minds, they saw that Zen had slightly raised his shadow-bearing sword and now held it horizontally. Buzz! The two-color sword radiance flashed outwards. Boom! Both the middle-aged man and Tyreek immediately felt intense agony as if their heads were being pounded at by a sledgehammer. In particular, Tyreek instinctively clutched his head with both hands and roared crazily. Crack! Romeo's sword had already arched out towards Tyreek. If it weren't for the fact that they now suffered from Zen's soul attack, the middle-aged man could have easily blocked his blow, and Tyreek could have easily avoided the strike. However, the whole fight script had been rewritten because of the soul attack. Romeo's sword hacked savagely at the golden light on Tyreek's body, and the golden light immediately dimmed before being snuffed out as his body cracked into pieces. After the first strike had banished the golden light, a second equally potent sword strike followed. This time, the sword plunged into Tyreek's chest. As half of the sword buried into Tyreek's torso, Romeo lowered his body, lifted his sword, and instantly cut Tyreek's head in half. After finishing off Tyreek, Romeo turned. Brandishing his sword, he slashed at the middle-aged man. Although the middle-aged man had also suffered from Zen's soul attack, his consciousness had recovered much more swiftly than Tyreek did. In only a few seconds, his eyes had cleared once more. The middle-aged man was shocked to see that Tyreek had been killed. In this world, there were few wild gods who had mastered the soul attack, of course, except for the really powerful masters of the various other races. However, those masters were not born in this world at all. This guy was then a completely new wild god. Since the wild god power within his body wasn't very strong, then how could he have unleashed such a powerful soul attack? Although the middle-aged man was both shocked and scared, his brain was swiftly racing as he considered his options. As long as he could kill this guy, Romeo would still be no match for him. He took a step to the right, and his mammoth-sized body rolled in the air, heading straight for Zen. Watch out! Romeo called a warning to Zen as he saw the middle-aged man's plan. Zen floated serenely in the air and watched the middle-aged man's more than 10,000 feet tall body turn on him. It was like watching a huge mountain turning over. However, Zen didn't look panicked at all. As the light of the shadow-bearing sword flashed again, a smile lit up his face. Buzz! The middle-aged man was once more hit by Zen's soul attack. In agony, he lost his balance and fell heavily on the ground. Romeo had gone through many battles, and there was no way that he would let such a good opportunity to kill his enemy slip by. He launched upward, and clasped his sword with both hands, prepared to strike. Before the middle-aged man once more regained his consciousness, the bamboo sword in Romeo's hand had struck down at the middle-aged man's head. Phew! The bamboo sword instantly nailed the middle-aged man's head to the ground, cracking it open like a melon. The middle-aged man's body struggled reflexively and then finally stopped twitching. Romeo clutched the bamboo sword tightly, ready for more actions as the adrenaline coursed in his body, and he was still a little nervous. After the middle-aged man's body sagged under its own weight, and it was clear that he had died, the wild god power in his body began to dissipate, and his mountainous body began to rapidly shrink. Romeo pulled his sword free. His face bubbled with joy as he thought of how narrowly he had escaped from death. He looked over at Zen, who floated not far away. Chapter 2145, Fully Loaded. Romeo had never imagined that he could narrowly escape death. What just happened was like a nightmare. Zen's sudden appearance had helped reverse the end result, especially for him at death's door. He was still in disbelief as he felt that he hadn't gone back yet on his senses. Thank you. Romeo faced Zen as he earnestly cupped his hands. Romeo, will never forget that you have saved my life. Zen only smiled faintly and uttered, even if I didn't make a move, after killing you, they would still come to kill me. It would count as I'm also saving myself. Don't take it to heart. Romeo shook his head and said, it's different. Without you, I couldn't have killed them. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Sarah, Amos and Hiram immediately turned back to their original figure and rushed straight over. Sir, are you okay? You have defeated 3 Yellow Emperor members all by yourself. I bet that among the young generation of the 9 Li race, no one can defeat you. Amos praised Romeo with a flattering expression on his face. In his eyes, Romeo was a nobleman who was beyond his reach. Going through the crisis together, he naturally would seize this opportunity to play up to Romeo. He was expecting that he might get the chance to enter a bone tower and even join the 9 race in the future. Sarah and Hiram on the side both frowned upon hearing Amos's flattering words towards Romeo. Anyone who wasn't blind could see and understand that the one who played the key role in winning the battle was Zen. If it weren't for Zen's powerful soul attack, every single one of them would have turned into corpses, including Romeo. Amos was the blind one, shamelessly talking nonsense just to flatter Romeo. Romeo glanced at him indifferently. These wild gods were nothing important in his eyes, and he felt that this Amos was more like a clown. In the midst of their fight, he had seen that Sarah and Hiram were the ones who had gone all out to fight back, but Amos was just standing far away. Obviously, he had no intention of taking action. He had no expectations that these wild gods would save him. After all, they had admission tokens and their purpose of coming here was to collect wild bones, and they didn't have the obligation to save anyone from the 9 race. But deep in his heart, he had no good impression of this guy who did nothing but brazenly cozied up to him. Romeo just glanced at him but didn't respond. As the core disciple of the 9 race, he was clear about the secret of the bone towers. There were so many wild gods in this world. After 3 years, they would all die under the light of adjudication. It was unfortunate that a vast majority of people had no idea that death was rapidly approaching. We can't stay in this area of immemorial wilderness any longer. The Yellow Emperor race has made a big move and this place is very dangerous. Will you leave with me? Romeo asked as he stared at Zen. He rather had a good impression on Zen, and he was a bit unwilling to let someone with such talent go. He thought Zen was even qualified to enter a bone tower, and in determination would like to recommend him to the leaders. However, Zen shook his head and replied, I still have to dig out the wild bones first. I will come to you in the future. He naturally wouldn't let go of such an opportunity to enter the 9 race. However, entering the immemorial wilderness was not an easy feat, and he had just dug out 2 pieces of blood wild bones. He felt reluctant to leave right now. Dig the wild bones. Romeo smiled and offered, I can give you 1 million wild bones. 1,000,000 wild bones was not a small amount for Romeo, but he could still afford it. He didn't like the idea of owing others a favor. If Zen would be willing to accept the 1 million wild bones, he could at least repay him for saving his life. 1 million, Zen raised his eyebrows at Romeo's offer. He was tempted by such a large number of wild bones, but in the end, he still refused the generous offer. He felt that the offer was much more than he could deserve. On the other hand, with his speed of digging the wild bones, it wouldn't be too difficult for him to accumulate 1,000,000 pieces in this area of immemorial wilderness. More importantly, he really needed to get the blood wild bones. Romeo was a bit disappointed hearing Zen's refusal. But on second thought, with this guy's soul force, it wouldn't be very dangerous for him to dig here as long as he didn't encounter powerful wild gods who would attack him. After all, this guy had the admission token of the 9 race. He then accepted Zen's refusal and didn't push further. He decided to go back first and report this to the elders of the race. Finding Zen would not be difficult if he wanted. Before leaving, he took away belongings of the 3 Yellow Emperor members and handed over a few items to Zen. Lastly, he asked about Sarah's and Hiram's names, then instructed, for the wild bones you have dug out this time, you 3 don't have to hand in a portion of them to our 9 race. I'll tell this to the person in charge. Half of the bones dug out in this part of the immemorial wilderness would be given to the 9 race. There were some people who were unwilling to let the 9 race have a share of their wild bones, and as a result, they were killed by the powerful warriors sent by the 9 race. Now no one dared break the rule. Sarah and Hiram felt overjoyed by Romeo's statement. A faint smile also appeared on Zen's face. As for Amos, who was standing beside, had a very long face. Romeo had mentioned 3 names referring to Zen, Sarah and Hiram, but his name was not included. Romeo didn't care about how Amos would feel. After bidding goodbye to Zen, he rose up and flew rapidly to get out of the immemorial wilderness. Are you still going to dig wild bones here? Zen asked as he looked at Sarah. Sarah was in all honesty frightened. She had wanted to go back. Romeo had already told them that they didn't need to hand in any wild bones to 9 race. It was indeed a great opportunity. After all, the wild bones she would finally get this time would be doubled compared to the past. It would also be helpful having Zen around with his strength and ability. It was the most important as she felt safe and secure with him. She had clearly seen that Zen had fully relied on his own abilities to kill Bilal. Romeo had also killed 2 Yellow Emperor wild gods, but he wouldn't have been successful without Zen's soul attack. Even without Romeo, Zen might have killed all these wild gods all by himself. Tagging along with a powerful warrior digging out the wild bones, she felt that she could do anything she wanted in this immemorial wilderness. She doubted that the Yellow Emperor race would send any more powerful people here just to kill them. Among the 4 people, only Amos was depressed. Zen, Sarah and Hiram weren't much affected and began to busy themselves digging for wild bones. The admission tokens issued by the 9 Li race had a time limit. They were only given a time limit of 18 days with the admission tokens they had. On the first day, Zen collected about 10,000 wild bones, and had also dug out 2 wild bones with Chiyu's bloodline. Much more that in the following days, he was still fortunate to have good luck on his side. On the second day, although he didn't get any blood wild bone, he dug out a big wild bone which was over 20 feet tall. Sarah was green with envy with the turn of events. On the third day, Zen dug out 3 blood wild bones. The 3 blood wild bones, however, were not the blood wild bones with Chiyu's bloodline. The following days, collecting the wild bones had gone smoothly without distractions. Perhaps it was because the Yellow Emperor race was busily planning on seizing the Sky South Bone Tower. The immemorial wilderness was very peaceful during this period of time. 18 days were already up. Zen had accumulated nearly 200,000 wild bones. In addition to that, he also obtained 7 or 8 kinds of blood wild bones, the total number of which added up to dozens. Despite the total number of wild bones he got, he was a little upset that there were only 4 blood wild bones that contained Chiyu's bloodline. At the same time, Sarah and Hiram had returned back fully loaded. But for Amos, perhaps he felt unhappy by not receiving the same treatment as the other 3 had, so he was depressed the whole time, making him leave the immemorial wilderness ahead of time. Chapter 2146, Giacomo. After leaving the immemorial wilderness, Zen and the others returned to the stronghold. According to the ordinances, these wild gods were obliged to have all of the wild bones they had found checked, while the 9 Li race would take half of the wild bones. Only then were they permitted to leave. The 9 Li race possessed a secret method to detect the amount of wild bones dug out by the wild gods. Even if they were to hide them in their space rings, they could not leave without the wild bones being detected. Every wild god was required to hand over all of the wild bones they had obtained to the 9 Li race for inspection. However, Zen and the 2 other wild gods with him didn't need to hand over half of their wild bones to the 9 Li race, yet they still needed to go through the inspection procedure. Master Romeo has informed us that you are to keep all your wild bones, and you are welcome to exchange the blood wild bones you have obtained for ordinary wild bones at market price here, the woman in emerald clothes said and smiled sweetly at Zen. Perhaps it was because of Romeo's instructions that she was very polite and treated Zen with respect. It was common practice here to exchange the blood wild bones for common wild bones at the market price. After all, the wild gods here didn't have any special blood lineage, therefore it was useless for them to keep any blood wild bones that they had found. Although it might not present the best deals to trade the blood wild bones at market price, it was convenient. Most of the wild gods chose to use this option. Sarah and Hiram didn't have any quarrel with this arrangement, and they handed over the blood wild bones they had found. Then someone came in and took the blood wild bones away. The 9 Li race would give them a correspondent number of common wild bones after they had evaluated the blood wild bones. Exchange the blood wild bones at market price. Zen frowned slightly as a suspicion formed in his mind. The woman in emerald noticed Zen's apprehensiveness and said with a smile, "Yes, you won't lose out on the price. That is not the problem. One type of the blood wild bones I have dug out has proven very useful to me. I'm afraid I can't exchange those," Zen said. The girl in emerald was now caught in a dilemma. Although Romeo had ordered special treatment be given to Zen, the rule was resolute. All kinds of blood wild bones the wild gods had gathered had to be handed over to the 9 Li race. After all, most of the major races suffered a severe shortage of blood wild bones of their own bloodlines. Only in trading the blood wild bones with each other could they gain access to the blood wild bones they needed. However, Zen didn't look like he could have any special bloodline in his body. The girl wondered what he wanted the blood wild bones for in the first place. The girl in emerald considered this and said, "Can I see the blood wild bones you have dug out?" Zen nodded and duly removed the collection of blood wild bones from his space ring. So many. The woman in emerald was aghast when she saw the impressive collection of blood wild bones now stacked on the table. Meanwhile, Sarah, Hiram, and the servants around were all stunned at the sight of so many bones piled up on the table. On the polished tabletop, there were an impressive variety of blood wild bones, and each emitted all kinds of light from cyan to brown, blood red and green. There were over 80 blood wild bones in the collection. It was unheard of. For ordinary wild gods entering the immemorial wilderness, the number of wild bones they could dig out in one visit ranged from 30,000 to 60,000. However, this part of immemorial wilderness was much more challenging than other parts of the immemorial wilderness. It required warriors to take greater risks, and the warriors would usually not dare to go into the highly dangerous core areas. In considering blood wild bones, generally speaking, it was already quite a feat if a warrior could obtain 4 or 5 of them in one collection trip. However, even if a warrior was extremely lucky, they would never collect more than 10 pieces. But Zen had actually gathered near 100 blood wild bones. That was an incredible feat and quite incomprehensible to everyone present in the hall. Even though Sarah and Hiram, who had been digging the wild bones together with Zen, knew that Zen had an acute affinity to the wild bones, they hadn't expected that he could have dug out so many blood wild bones. "Which kind of blood wild bones do you need to keep?" the girl in emerald asked in a subdued tone while staring at the blood wild bones lying on the table. Zen reached out his hand and selected 4 pieces of brown wild bones from the collection. "I just need these 4 blood wild bones, then you can exchange the rest of them for ordinary wild bones." Seeing the 4 blood wild bones Zen had chosen, the girl in emerald arched her beautiful eyebrows and said, "You can't take the wild bones with Chiyu's bloodline. For the blood wild bones that contained the bloodline of other races, the 9 Li race only kept them for the purpose of trading with other races to obtain bones that contained Chiyu's bloodline. If Zen had really needed some blood wild bones containing bloodline of other races, the girl might have made an exception for Zen and let him keep them. However, the blood wild bones with Chiyu's bloodline were treasures that they were determined to own." Zen frowned. His biggest goal was to find the blood wild bones with Chiyu's bloodline, so how could he let anyone take them away now that he had? "Zen, it's useless for you to claim these blood wild bones. Surely, you can't absorb the wild god power in them, can you?" Hiram, who stood beside Zen, couldn't help asking. "Yes, it's completely useless for you to possess these blood wild bones, however, they are of vital importance to our race," the girl agreed. Zen suddenly asked, "What if I can, in fact, absorb the wild god power in them?" Hearing this, those gathered in the hall were stunned. Some of them were completely overwhelmed by this statement, and they didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Only those of the 9 Li race were able to absorb the power contained in the brown blood wild bones. This was a common knowledge. It was preposterous for Zen to even suggest that he had this ability. The girl in emerald smiled condescendingly and was about to speak when a voice suddenly sounded from the other side of the hall. "If you can absorb the wild god power of those blood wild bones, the 9 Li race will reward you with another 50 pieces of blood wild bones." A silver-haired middle-aged man walked forward and spoke into the silence. The middle-aged man was quite dignified with his silver hair, and he was of medium height. His luminous eyes shone with sharp light, and no one dared to look him in the eye. What was even stranger was that the wild god power he emitted was an indistinct and elusive aura. It was as if his wild god power had transcended to another level. Since coming to this world, Zen had met a lot of wild gods. Although their bodies were impressively strong, Zen had always felt confident that he could kill them with all his strength. But the middle-aged man with silver hair was something new. He gave Zen an unfathomable feeling of the unknown. When the lady in emerald saw the middle-aged man with silver hair, she was both shocked and awed. She made obeisance and greeted, "Sir, what an honor to see you here. Please forgive me for not personally welcoming you." Giacomo waved his hand, and his eyes were also staring at Zen. He carefully sized Zen up from head to toe and said with a smile, "A man of wilderness has actually achieved status as a top-ranked true god. I wonder what experiences you have faced to bring you to this achievement." Those living in the Bone Towers would never refer to the wild gods outside the Bone Towers as pariahs. After all, that would be too disrespectful, so he only called Zen a man of wilderness. Zen cupped his hands and asked, "Are you serious about the challenge that you laid down just now, sir?" "Of course, but there is no need to try, for it is futile." "You can't do it, ha ha ha." Giacomo laughed heartily, "But you saved my nephew, Romeo, and he said you are extremely powerful. Now we of the 9 Li race are badly in need of talent. It's not difficult for us to give you one set of blood of our 9 Li race. Do you want to take it?" Giacomo had come here specially for Zen. This time, the 9 Li race and the Yellow Emperor race had made a bet to determine ownership of the Sky South Bone Tower in this part of the immemorial wilderness. However, while making the bet, the Yellow Emperor race had killed Chandler and Farhan of the 9 Li race. These two men had both been powerful warriors of the younger generation of the 9 Li race. With the 9 Li race's loss of them, they would most probably now lose the bet. 9 Li race was consumed with fury, but their opponent hadn't broken any rules. So the 9 Li race had no avenue to voice their complaints. They could only blame themselves for not having been better prepared to prevent being tricked by their opponent. After Romeo's return to the Bone Tower, he had recommended Zen to Giacomo. Without any hesitation, the latter had immediately rushed to the stronghold, hoping to find out whether Zen was as magically strong as Romeo had described. Hearing Giacomo's offer, everyone present became tense, and greed burned in their eyes. The face of the woman in emerald also became tinged with envy. Born into a large sect in the Bone Tower, she had an extraordinary background, but even she was not qualified to be gifted with a set of Chiyu's blood. Chapter 2147, Blood. Blood transfusion was not an easy task. It was said that such a thing had to be done by powerhouses of the 9 Li race. For most of the wild gods in the world, this was undoubtedly an opportunity to completely change their fate. In the past, only a warrior from another race who made great contributions to the 9 Li race could earn such a privilege. If it weren't for the pressure from the Yellow Emperor race, the 9 Li race wouldn't have decided to let Zen in. As far as Giacomo was concerned, Zen was very lucky to have such a good chance that was only given once in 1,000 years. So naturally, he believed that Zen would accept this chance with excitement. However, Zen just gave a slight nod in response. Of course I'm willing, but before that, I still hope to have a try. I want to know if I can directly absorb the wild god power in them. Hearing Zen's words, Sarah, the woman in emerald, and the others stood still, staring at Zen with confusion on their faces. What a lucky reward, but why isn't Zen immediately accepting it? Giacomo himself frowned, feeling a little angry. In an affronted tone, he said, well, let me see if you can absorb the wild god power of our 9 Li race. Without saying anything more, Zen grabbed one of the blood wild bones with one hand. The truth was that Zen himself was not sure if he could directly absorb the blood wild bone. After all, he had undergone the process of blood exchange, so he had no idea if his blood would be compatible with the blood of the wild bone. Master Giacomo, the wild bone would be wasted in this way, the woman in emerald said worriedly. If Zen extracted the wild god power from the wild bone and his body wasn't able to absorb it, then all the wild god power would dissipate. It wasn't advisable at all to let Zen waste the blood wild bone just for the sake of an experiment. It doesn't matter, Giacomo said as he waved his hand. He was too offended to think straight. Ignoring the tense atmosphere around him, Zen gently moved his hand over the surface of the brown wild bone, and brown waves of wild god power burst out like spring water. Trickle spring method. A trace of disdain appeared on everyone's face when they saw Zen's skill. Although Zelda belonged to the Warden race, the method she had cultivated to become a wild god was not inherited from this race. She had learned the trickle spring method from other places, and it was a relatively clumsy method. These people naturally looked down upon Zen when they saw him using such a clumsy tactic. In particular, Giacomo's anger rose when he saw Zen using this method. He was afraid that the blood wild bone was going to be wasted, just like the woman in emerald had warned. After Zen extracted the brown wild god power, he guided it to immerse in his own body. The moment the wild god power was infused into his body, Zen felt a different power within. This power contained a primitive restlessness that even affected Zen's mind. He had a strange feeling, like his heart was shrinking violently. It was almost as if the power was threatening to be released from the confines of his body. However, Zen managed to contain it. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Wisps of brown wild god power continuously entered his body, but they did not spread out at all. In a short while, he managed to absorb all the wild god power in the blood wild bone as the people in the hall stared at him in stunned silence. Even Giacomo was dumbfounded. A warrior's flesh body would try to repel the wild god power if the blood of the wild bone didn't match theirs. Even if it was forcefully absorbed, by all logic, the flesh would reject it, causing it to dissipate into the air. But somehow, Zen had absorbed all of it. More importantly, the wild god power hadn't dissipated even a little bit. Even Giacomo would waste about 30% of the wild god power when refining a wild bone. However, Zen had actually absorbed all of the wild god power into his body. This was even more surprising than the fact that he had managed to absorb the blood wild bone of the 9 Li race. Did you already know that you have Chiyu's blood? Who are your parents? Giacomo asked in disbelief. The only explanation that made sense was that Zen was born in the 9 Li race. But the members of the 9 Li race were not allowed to breed with outsiders. There were no exceptions to this rule in the Sky Spirit Bone Tower. But today, Zen, who must have the blood of the 9 Li race, had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It was natural for Giacomo to feel confused. You don't know my parents. Zen smiled, but it seems that you want to fulfill your promise. Giacomo looked at Zen with a complicated expression on his face. After a long while, he said, if I know where you come from, I will fulfill my promise, and those blood wild bones are yours. Take your things and go with me. I still want to dig the wild bones. Zen said. No matter how many bones you need, I can give them to you. But you can't get any of the admission tokens, said Giacomo coldly. Zen fell silent. The woman in Emerald was good at gauging people's minds. She knew that this was not a small matter, so she sent someone to exchange the other blood wild bones that Zen had. As for the remaining 3 wild bones of Chiyu's blood, she naturally didn't mention them. After handling these matters, Zen bid goodbye to Sarah and the others, and left with Giacomo. Looking at Zen's back as he left, Sarah and Hiram sighed. They hadn't expected that the one who had been with them for the past few days was actually from the 9 Li race. But even if Zen was really from the 9 Li race, it was impossible to explain his strength. They had never seen anyone who had cultivated to become a true god be so powerful before. High in the sky, Zen flew at high speed, following behind Giacomo. Master Giacomo, where are we going? Zen asked. Just call me Giacomo. Giacomo, Zen echoed. I don't know who you are. But do you know how long you would live if you didn't come here at this time? Giacomo asked deliberately. Zen thought for a moment, and then smiled and said, maybe 3 years. So you know. Giacomo raised his eyebrows. Only a few people knew about the light of adjudication, and these people would go all out to fight and get into the bone tower to avoid the disaster that occurred once in 1,000 years. Zen nodded. Yes, that's why I came here, he said frankly. Let me take you to the Sky Spirit Bone Tower. First, I want to know how pure your blood is. If it turns out that you are really from our 9 Li race, we will treat you well, said Giacomo. Even though he had seen Zen suck the blood wild bone dry in front of his own eyes, it was still difficult for him to believe. After all, it made no sense at all. Zen had mainly cultivated the true god system and he had strong mental power. Now, it turned out that he had Chiyu's blood running through his veins too. It was hard for Giacomo to imagine that these characteristics would appear in a foreign member he did not know. You want to know how pure my blood is? Zen was a bit confused. Giacomo looked at Zen calmly. Our race has the noblest blood in the world. It has been passed on to us by our progenitor, Chiyu. However, the purity of each person's blood is different. We usually check the purity of a person's blood the day they're born. Of course, you can't be exempted from this tradition either. Chapter 2148, Enter the Bone Tower. Zen nodded and followed Giacomo in silence. He had felt a strange sensation in his body while absorbing the blood wild bone, as if something in his body was going to come into being. Although this feeling was fleeting and felt like background noise to him, it still existed. He wondered what it meant. Romeo was a member of 9 Li race. After activating his form of wild god, he came to possess 2 heads and 4 hands. It was the blood wild body of 9 Li race. Zen wondered if his own wild god too would have 2 heads and 4 hands, now that he had absorbed enough blood wild bones. Some time passed as they flew over, and Zen realized that Giacomo had taken him back to Heron City. Heron City was large and had a huge number of guards. When Zen had come here for the first time, he had been cautious and alert, not daring to cross the guards in the slightest. He had no reason to invite trouble for himself. Giacomo flew into Heron City with Zen behind him. Immediately as they entered, 7 or 8 streaks of light flew toward them. Zen looked them up and down. These people, he assumed, were high-ranking figures of the city. Although they did not have the blood of the 9 Li race, their cultivation basis seemed very high to him. Master Giacomo, Master Giacomo, they cupped their hands in unison and greeted Giacomo respectfully. Heron City was under the management of Star Sect, a sect associated with 9 Li race. Giacomo was respected by the warriors of the race, and so naturally these people showed him deference. Although they were utterly respectful toward Giacomo, their gazes fell on Zen from time to time. Giacomo wanted to use the transmission array in Heron City, saying he had an urgent matter to deal with. The people assumed that it had something to do with the man behind him. Is the transmission array ready? Giacomo asked them impatiently. The leader of the group nodded. Yes, it is. Please come this way, Master Giacomo. Take me there, said Giacomo. The leader waved his hand and the rest of the company retreated. He led the way and the 3 of them flew to the west of the city. In a giant square in the west of the city, a huge transmission array had already been activated. It appeared like a delicate lotus leaf, slowly turning, a halo of soft pink light encircling it. After landing from the skies, Giacomo and Zen walked straight to this very exquisite transmission array. Buzz. As the transmission array rotated, the soft light immediately blanketed Zen and Giacomo, taking them along its movement. The scene before Zen seemed to waver before his eyes as they made the journey. At this moment, his speed had increased by 1,000,000, even 10,000,000 times. They had traveled a long distance in a relatively short time. The principles of this particular transmission array were obviously different from those of the other arrays Zen had encountered before. Before he knew it, a jade-white wall appeared in front of Zen. It stood like a beast before him, blocking his way. The wall was so high that Zen could not see where it ended. This wall is huge. Zen was a little stunned, but then soon realized that it was a bone tower. This huge beast bone was about the same height as the divine land, perhaps 100 trillion miles high. Although the beast bone was thin, the wall's width could have been a few trillion miles wide. Now that he was standing right below the bone tower, in comparison he must be even smaller than the smallest of dust particles, which was why he could not see the top of the tower. It seemed to have disappeared among the clouds. Staring at the giant bone tower, Zen was struck dumb for several moments. This is the Sky Spirit Bone Tower belonging to our 9 Li race. There was a prominent hint of pride in Giacomo's voice as he uttered these words. Those able to occupy a bone tower were considered to be among the greatest races of this world. Even if some races possessed special blood, they were likely to share a bone tower with the other races. In comparison, this Sky Spirit Bone Tower was the sole belonging of 9 Li race. I heard that these bone towers belonged to the body of a Chaos Ancient God. How powerful was this Chaos Ancient God prior to his death? Zen asked, finally recovering from his shock. Given the enormous body of the Chaos Ancient God, he could have crushed the divine land with his giant feet in one go. That's not something we have given much thought to, Giacomo said lightly, glancing at Zen in surprise. Many people knew that the bone towers had been the corpse of a Chaos Ancient God, but only a handful of them were curious about just how powerful the Chaos Ancient God was. Zen nodded in reply. Slowly, he stepped forward and entered the Sky Spirit Bone Tower along with Giacomo. Beneath the Sky Spirit Bone Tower was an enormous crack 10,000,000 feet high. As Zen walked into the crack at the bottom of the Sky Spirit Bone Tower, he was suddenly bound by a strange aura. Covered by this aura, Zen felt a strange despondence settle in him. At the same time, he heard a peculiar scream. The voice seemed to be purring something to Zen and constantly shuttling around his ears. But when he listened carefully, he heard nothing. It was when he paid no heed to it that the voice sounded again. It seemed to come from the depths of his soul. The whole experience was baffling. Giacomo noticed the change in Zen's expression and said, although the Chaos Ancient God is dead, his will is not going to dissipate anytime soon. Perhaps it will linger here for eternity. You will get used to it after a while. Even if a true God died, the power of their physical body lasted for a long time. And the Chaos Ancient God was in a different league altogether. Zen understood this, but he had another question. Everyone in this world absorbs the power of the wild bones. Can the power in the Chaos Ancient God's bones be absorbed as well? Giacomo let out a hoot of laughter as he heard Zen's question. Good idea. I'm afraid I will be invincible in this world if I absorb the wild god power of the bone towers. But it's a thought. Don't underestimate the wild god power of the bone towers. Even if you wield all your strength, you won't be able to destroy them the slightest bit. Even the most powerful warriors in 9 Li race fall flat. These people had lived in the bone tower for a number of years, so this idea must have occurred to them as well. For so many years, no one had been able to damage the bone tower in the slightest, not even create a crack on it. Still, there were a few giant cracks in the bone tower. The 9 Li people lived inside these cracks, but they were not the ones to create them. These had existed from a long time ago. It was speculated that the Chaos Ancient God had been seriously injured before he fell into this world, so the mottled cracks in the bone tower must have been left behind at that time. If the corpse of the Chaos Ancient God was intact and devoid of cracks in his bones, then no one in this world could have hidden inside the bone towers. It was a fact. For instance, there was no crack in the heavenly wild bone tower, and no one had been able to dig out a crack in it either. No race was able to step in the heavenly wild bone tower. It was a worthless endeavor. Zen and Giacomo flew in the air through the crack and the space ahead suddenly narrowed. It was so tapered that only one person could pass through. However, after a period of time, the space widened again. What appeared in front of Zen was an area spanning 3 large cities. Several buildings occupied the space and many of the wild gods were hurriedly shuttling through it. Have we arrived? Zen asked quietly. Giacomo shook his head. This is where the 3 affiliated sects of 9 Li race live. Our race resides at the top. He pointed to the ceiling in the air. A wide crack could be seen above their heads. On the other side were a flight of steps that extended to a higher place. The bone was extraordinarily firm. No one was able to carve the steps out, so they had to be built out of other materials. Chapter 2149, Grand Elder. Giacomo and Zen flew to the top of the roof. Once they landed there, they climbed up the stairs. Halfway up, Zen saw another Chiyu statue with 3 heads and 3 pairs of arms. Giacomo took a step forward and respectfully bowed to the Chiyu statue. This is the leader of our 9 Li race. Before you become a member of our race, you have to worship him with sincerity. Although Giacomo had managed to smoothly bring Zen to the Bone Tower, it was extremely difficult for one to become qualified enough to enter the Bone Tower. The light of adjudication, which appeared once every 1,000 years, could take away anybody's life. Those who knew about it were desperate to enter one of the Bone Towers because only the Bone Towers were able to resist the light of adjudication. There were even those who were willing to become guards of the 9 Li race's affiliated sects just so that they could enter the race's Bone Tower. After all, entering a Bone Tower was the only way that could guarantee them a longer life. As for going up this staircase and entering the 9 Li race's territory, that was the lifetime dream for many people. It meant getting Chiyu's blood, which would open the door to countless possibilities. Every member of the 9 Li race had the utmost respect for Chiyu. So before entering the 9 Li race's territory, they would worship the Chiyu statue first. Now, Giacomo treated Zen as a member of the 9 Li race too. Although he couldn't understand how, Zen had managed to absorb the energy of the blood-wild bone right in front of his eyes. When Zen heard Giacomo's words, he didn't hesitate at all. His mother had told him that Chiyu was his maternal grandfather, so he worshipped the statue like Giacomo did. Then, the two of them continued on their way up. Soon, a large cave lit up by a raging firelight coming into view. The cave was filled with countless huge palaces. This was the real territory of the 9 Li race. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. About 7 people suddenly flew over from the cave. The head of the group was tall and strong, and he had a bare torso and messy hair. Before he even landed in front of Zen and Giacomo, he said, "Giacomo, you want to give this boy the blood of our race?" At the sight of this man, a touch of displeasure appeared on Giacomo's face. He coldly replied, "Yes. So what? Are you dissatisfied with what I'm going to do, Eric?" No matter how united a race was, there were always internal disputes. According to the 9 Li race's rules, Chiyu's blood could only be given to 10 people every 1,000 years. Each drop of blood was incomparably precious. Not all the members of the 9 Li race had pure Chiyu's blood. Even if one's parents were both members of the 9 Li race, it was possible that they didn't have Chiyu's blood. Therefore, there were always disputes among the 9 Li members over the precious blood. Naturally, it was even more difficult for people who were not from the 9 Li race to get Chiyu's blood. In the last 997 years, 9 people had already gotten Chiyu's blood, which left just one more person who could have that chance. Therefore, all the people in the 9 Li race were trying to win the blood. The man with long, disheveled hair was called Eric. His close friend was the leader of Blue Moon Sect, a subsidiary of the 9 Li race. So, for the sake of his friend, he was making every effort to get Chiyu's blood. Until recently, he had thought that he could get Chiyu's blood for his friend for sure, but there had been a sudden change in the 9 Li race. The deaths of Chandler and Farhan had caused a situation where no one among the young generation's geniuses was able to fight against the Yellow Emperor race. Romeo, who had safely returned to the 9 Li race, had recommended Zen to the race. Upon hearing about Zen's outstanding performance, the senior leaders of the 9 Li race had decided to test Zen first. If Zen was really as strong as Romeo had told them, they would give Chiyu's blood to Zen. Giacomo had been ordered to bring Zen back, but he hadn't expected that Zen would already be able to refine the blood-wild bone on his own. He didn't know how to proceed, so he had decided to bring Zen back first. However, Eric didn't know about this sudden turn of events. Thinking that Zen had come to fight for Chiyu's blood, he felt annoyed from the bottom of his heart. "I didn't dare to protest against the decision made by the Grand Elder. But I still doubt that he can pass the test." Glancing up and down at Zen, Eric chuckled. "I can tell that he has cultivated the true God system. Those of the wilderness are always so weird." Although Zen had absorbed a wild bone with Chiyu's blood, it was too little power for Eric to notice. Zen's eyebrows slightly furrowed when he heard what Eric said. He didn't appreciate how dismissive and sarcastic Eric was being. But before he could reply with a cutting comment of his own, Giacomo smiled coldly and said, "Don't worry. He will pass the test without any problem. I believe Romeo. He is a good boy who never lies. But there is one thing that might disappoint you. Zen doesn't need to pass the test." Eric's face darkened when he heard this. He asked, "What do you mean? Grand Elder wants to give the blood to him directly." Ha ha. Looking at Eric's gloomy expression, Giacomo was secretly thrilled. Intentionally keeping the explanation to himself, he turned around and said to Zen, "Come with me. I will take you to meet the Grand Elder." Swish. Eric appeared in front of Giacomo and blocked his way. "Tell me. Otherwise, I won't let you leave." Giacomo stared at Eric coldly. "What, do you want to fight with me?" Eric scowled, but he stood firmly in front of Giacomo without any intention of letting them pass. Zen couldn't help smiling. Giacomo is so naughty. Why didn't he just tell Eric the truth? While these two people stood off against each other, a figure floated over. "Giacomo, no matter who wants to join our 9Li race, they must be tested by me first. Even if this child is as special as Romeo said, a test is inevitable. Didn't we reach that agreement at the beginning?" The voice was as sweet and melodious as a beautiful song. Even without seeing her, anyone who heard her voice could tell that she must be extremely beautiful. Zen turned his gaze to the direction where the sound came from and saw a bright figure not too far away, floating in the air. It was a woman with snow-white skin and bare feet. She wasn't wearing any clothes, but her private parts were covered by pink silk cloth. Her silver hair was tied back in a bun, and her face was even more stunning. She blinked gently and looked Zen up and down. The moment she appeared, the tense atmosphere suddenly eased. Eric gave her a salute and said, "You are right, Grand Elder. I believe Giacomo wants to directly give this brat the blood." "This woman is the Grand Elder?" Zen wondered in shock. After shooting a triumphant glance at Eric, Giacomo strode toward the Grand Elder and said, "I didn't mean it. I wanted to meet you, but not for the blood, because Zen doesn't need the blood at all." Not understanding the meaning of Giacomo's words, the Grand Elder replied, "If he really has the strength to fight against the young talents of Yellow Emperor race, then he must accept the blood of our race. After all, according to the gambling agreement, the one who fights for our race must be a member of our race." "So what do you mean, Giacomo?" "I mean that Zen is already a member of our race. Grand Elder, I wanted to come to you just to test the purity of his blood," Giacomo explained in a proud voice. Chapter 2150, Blood at the 6th grade. Grand Elder, Eric as well as the rest of the crowd showed a puzzled expression. Eric's face had darkened. He stared at Giacomo and asked, "Giacomo, do you know what you are talking about?" A strange expression gradually appeared on the Grand Elder's delicate and white face. She also stared at Giacomo indifferently and asked, "Did you just say that Zen is originally a member of our race?" Giacomo naturally knew that they wouldn't believe it. If he hadn't seen with his own eyes that Zen had absorbed a piece of blood-wild bone, he wouldn't have believed it either. There were overall 7,000 people who had Chiyu's bloodline, and all of them lived in the Sky Spirit Bone Tower. It was quite incredible learning that a stranger had the same bloodline like them. "Yes, I saw it with my own eyes. He has absorbed a wild bone containing Chiyu's bloodline," Giacomo clarified, nodding his head. Giacomo explained with such determination, but the rest still looked skeptical about it, especially Eric, who stared at him vigilantly and questioned, "Giacomo, are you playing some tricks?" Giacomo felt unhappy about the way Eric questioned. He sneered and said, "Since you don't believe me, let Grand Elder assess Zen. I believe that Zen can pass the test. It's not bad for Zen to get an extra blood of our race." If Zen didn't have a need to transplant blood, the only remaining blood within 1,000 years would naturally be given to Eric's friend. Eric became silent upon hearing Giacomo's response. It was true that they were on bad terms, but if what he said was true, it would be an advantage for him. "Stop arguing." The Grand Elder floated up gently and stopped in front of Zen, her attractive eyes staring at him. "Whether you have the blood of our 9Li race, we can know it through a test at once. Eric, go and inform our clansmen to bring all the children of 6 years old or over. I'll take care of the preparation. Zen, you and our clansmen will participate in the blood purity test." After she gave out further instructions, she smiled at Zen. Gently twisting her waist, she retreated into the distance. A few moments passed. About 400 to 500 people of the 9Li race had gathered in the square. The crowd were immersed in whispers and discussion. "Why is the blood purity test advanced? It is said that an outsider has our bloodline, so they moved it ahead of the schedule." "How is that possible? Our race's blood is noble. How can an outsider have it? Could his blood be stolen? That's impossible. What do you think the blood is?" Do you think you can steal it as you want? Even Grand Elder is unable to transplant blood. Zen and Giacomo were just standing on one side of the square and heard the words spoken. With an embarrassed smile on his face, Giacomo explained, our 9Li race always takes our bloodline seriously, so they probably have enmity towards you. Please don't take it to heart. Zen smiled. Of course, he wouldn't make a fuss with these people. Everyone waited for a while, and a soft white flash flew over. The Grand Elder appeared in the center of the square. She spoke to everyone with a smile. The blood purity test should have been held 4 months later. But we will get it earlier this time. The blood purity test was specifically used to test the purity of blood. It was held every few years. The test was specially prepared for the children who had just grown up in the 9Li race. Why must it be advanced? My daughter just turned 6 years old yesterday. That's so unfair for her to participate in the blood purity test. Yes, holding the blood purity test in advance for an outsider. Do you take him too seriously? What if he is lying? The 9Li race generally believed that to test the blood purity at the right age of children growing up would increase the purity of the blood. The purity of the blood was already set from the moment one was born. However, in order to seek greater benefits for their own children, the clansmen decided to appoint the blood purity test at the time the children reached 6 years of age. The Grand Elder slowly stretched out her hand and gently waved at the crowd. The clansmen in the square immediately quieted down. They heard her lightly say, if you don't want to participate in the blood purity test, you can leave. The ones who stay here will start now. With a gentle clap of her hands, an oval array appeared in the center of the square. With the light in the array flickering, an oval jade floated up. The jade was about the size of a washbasin, emitting a faint milky white light. There were no flaws on its surface, looking like a huge egg. When the white jade fully appeared, the Grand Elder turned to Zen maintaining a faint smile, saying, Zen, you can come over now. Zen nodded. He took a step and was about to walk over but was suddenly interrupted. A clansman unexpectedly emerged from the other side of the square and cried out, why do you ask an outsider to carry out the test first? My Jeffrey and Frida have to take the test first. As he spoke, a boy and a girl were brought forward, each being carried on his arms. At the sight of this, Zen stood still and casually shrugged his shoulders. He naturally would never fight with the children. The Grand Elder shook her head slightly. These clansmen had always been very resistant to foreign people. She was a little helpless, but couldn't refute and say anything about it. She could only agree. In that case, test Jeffrey and Frida first. Jeffrey and Frida were twins of 6 years old. Being brought in front of the beautiful white jade, the two children were elated and couldn't help but circle around it. The Grand Elder squatted in front of them and smiled sweetly. She reached out at Frida and gently grasped her hands. Grand Elder, why are you holding my hand? Frida asked, blinking her big eyes. Because it will be a little painful, the Grand Elder explained. Her fingertip flashed a white light as thin as a needle and gently poked it on the tip of Frida's finger. Several drops of blood flowed out from her fingertip. Frida felt pain from her finger and was about to cry, but the Grand Elder already stretched out her arm, gently touching her forehead. The pain immediately disappeared. As for the drops of blood, they were guided in midair by the Grand Elder. The drops of blood had fused, and they fell towards the jade. Bits of bright red blood blossomed on the jade's surface, and were swiftly absorbed by the jade in the blink of an eye. Buzz! The jade started to tremble. The pure white jade started to glow with red light, and was constantly turning fully red. It's already the 3rd grade. And the color is still changing. It's the 4th grade. Maybe Frida's blood could be above the 5th grade. I've told you that the purity of Frida's blood is definitely great. The clansman who had carried the two children in his arms before uttered in excitement. A few seconds later, the color of the jade stopped changing and became stable. The Grand Elder then announced flatly, Frida's blood is at the top of 6th grade, and will reach 7th grade soon. Congratulations, Akshay. The purity of blood was divided into 10 grades. The 6th grade blood was considered as a top grade in the 9Li race. In the future, the girl would surely be of great importance in her race. Frida's father, Akshay, was naturally thrilled when he learned that her blood would reach the 7th grade surely. Chapter 2151, An Accident. Quickly moving, Akshay stepped forward and picked Frida up, throwing her in the air and letting out a cheer. All over the square, the 9Li members also started to cheer. Talent was bestowed by the bloodline and the races had to maintain their power. That was why this world had a strong sense of racial crisis. The result of the test proved that Frida was a worthy successor. It was a cause for a huge celebration since within this 1,000 years, only 2 people had the 6th grade blood, and Frida was the only one who had the quasi-7th grade blood. Naturally, this was something worth celebrating. The still dazed Frida had no idea on what was happening. Then it was her brother's turn. The method was the same as the Grand Elder pierced Jeffrey's finger to get a few drops of blood and then threw them on the jade. Plop, buzz. As the blood was absorbed by the jade, it began to shake once more and its color began to turn red. It was changing, but it was very slow. Akshay and all the other 9 Li members stared at the jade nervously. Jeffrey's blood isn't good. It's been so long, but his blood is only at the 2nd grade. I'm afraid it won't reach the 3rd grade. Well, a dragon can have 9 different sons, and brothers born of the same parents differ from each other, even purity of boy-girl twins' blood would greatly differ. It took a few more moments, but eventually, the Grand Elder announced, Jeffrey's blood is at the 3rd grade. Unlike earlier, Akshay silently stepped forward to pick up Jeffrey and gently pat his back. Blood purity was largely decided by luck and no one could change it. It was already a great blessing from God to have Frida in his family. After their turn, the rest of the people carried their children over to undergo the same test. Most of the other children had blood that was 3rd grade to 5th grade. 3rd grade was average, but 5th grade was outstanding. Those who were graded as just the standard would feel depressed, while those who were graded outstanding would feel excited. It was the normal situation for every blood purity test, and the Grand Elder was used to seeing it, so she remained calm and composed. When the test was almost over, the Grand Elder turned to Zen. It's your turn. It made her very interested in whether Zen owned Chiyu's blood or not. Slowly, Zen walked up to the oval jade and looked at it up and down. From what he saw, the jade would turn red after it absorbed blood and then turn milky white again after a while. The deeper the red color, the purer the blood was. The problem was Zen had golden blood. Would the jade still work? The Grand Elder smiled at him. Give me your hand. Can I do it myself? Zen asked. The Grand Elder shook her head and grabbed Zen's arm. She condensed a milky white fine needle in her palm and shot it out towards Zen. However, what happened next surprised the Grand Elder. There was a clank and the light needle couldn't pierce Zen's finger. It wasn't within the Grand Elder's expectation that Zen was so strong that the needle wouldn't be able to break through his finger's skin. It made her stare at him in shock. A trace of a helpless smile appeared on Zen's face. I said that I could do it myself. Instead of answering him, the Grand Elder just condensed another needle that was several times more powerful than the one before. Ding! The needle still failed to pierce Zen's finger. It was unbelievable, but the Grand Elder was still unconvinced after she stared at Zen for several seconds and condensed another needle that spiraled up from the white light. It emitted an astonishing power. The light needle flew towards Zen's finger and it finally managed to pierce it. Plop, 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 golden blood. The Grand Elder was a little surprised. Even Giacomo, Eric, and other 9 Li members who saw the golden blood felt strange because they had never seen blood of that color. The Grand Elder didn't think too much and splashed the golden blood on the jade. When it absorbed the golden blood, the jade gave a buzzing sound. Eventually, the jade's color began to change. It's turning red. Does this boy really have the blood of our 9 Li race? But the color is changing so slowly. I really doubt that his blood could reach the 2nd grade. All the 9 Li members began to gossip as they stared at the changing jade. It excited Eric to see the jade changing color. Ha ha ha, Giacomo, you're not bad. The boy you brought back really has our blood. It's a pity that his blood's only at the 2nd grade. It's not that good. As long as it proved that Zen had Chiyu's blood, then they didn't need to transplant blood into Zen. It was a good thing for Eric. Instead of answering Eric, Giacomo frowned at the jade because he felt that this matter wasn't that simple. After about half a minute, the surface of the jade was still glowing with a faint pink light. The blood of this man from the wilderness isn't good. Is it a son left behind by one of our clansmen? A 2nd grade blood is too ordinary. He should feel content. It's good fortune for him that he could stay in a bone tower for the rest of his life. There was a hint of disappointment that flashed through the Grand Elder's eyes. She wasn't satisfied with the result, but she still just smiled. Congratulations. You do have the blood of our race, but it's a pity that your grade is too low. Zen wasn't too disappointed. Even if his mother told him that he had the purest blood of the 9 Li race and that he was the most legitimate descendant of Chiyu, that didn't change the fact that his blood had been exchanged. Zen could accept this result. As long as he could prove himself to the 9 Li race and stay, then his goal was achieved. Right when Zen nodded, the jade beside him suddenly let out a crisp sound. All eyes turned to the jade. A blood-red crack appeared on the surface of the jade. Crack, crack, Crack! With every explosive sound, a new blood-red fracture ruptured on the jade. It took only a few more moments for the surface of the flawless white jade to be filled with bloody cracks. Buzz! The color of the jade started to quickly change as it shook. The previous pale pink color gradually turned bright red and then became dark red, as if blood was bleeding from the jade's surface. Crack, crack, crack. Soon, the jade broke into pieces right in front of their eyes. The noisy square suddenly fell silent as everyone was confused by the unexpected scene. The jade was bestowed by a powerful master of the 9 Li race and endured years of blood purity tests. It was unanticipated that the jade would break into pieces today. Chapter 2152, Exiles. As she watched the scene play out before her, the Grand Elder felt confused. The others didn't know much about the blood purity test. In fact, they only knew that the jade could test blood purity, but they understood nothing of the principle behind it. The Grand Elder, on the other hand, did understand. She had been given the jade long ago by her own father. This jade, named Bloodstone, was actually very weak, but it could activate the power hidden within the blood. If the hidden blood power was strong, then the stone's coloring would change. Notably, the Bloodstone could do more than just test the 9 Li race's blood. It could equally test the blood of other races. The arrays arranged for the multiple tests were different and had their own respective colors. The Grand Elder herself had blood at the top of the 8th grade, almost at the 9th, to be more specific. Once, she had dripped her blood on the Bloodstone, and the stone changed into a deep red hue. She was her father's first-generation successor, and her blood's purity far surpassed that of other 9 Li members. Now though, the Bloodstone had turned dark red, but it broke. What could this possibly mean? Zen, stay here, I'll be back soon. The Grand Elder took a long, meaningful look at him before reaching out her hand to gently touch the broken stone fragments. In the blink of an eye, all the pieces of bloodstone fragments immediately collected in her hands. Whoosh! With a slight twist of her feminine waist, she quickly turned into a streak of white light, silently retreating off into the distance. At that moment, one could hear many people discussing with low voices in the square. A quiet mumble rolled over the small crowd. The 9 Li members weren't foolish though, and they understood Zen's special characteristics. Many warriors watched him incessantly with uneasy expressions on their faces. Hey brat, tell me, how did you break the stone, huh? Giacomo laughed mockingly. The bloodstone's color change could prove that Zen's blood was also at the 9th grade. In all, only 2 people had 9th grade blood, and that was including the Grand Elder. It was extremely rare. I don't know either. Zen was also confused. He had no logical response. The Grand Elder walked through the cave for a while before entering another small and narrow cavity. A short while later, she had reached the front of a jade wall. She stood her ground steadily and called out in a low voice, "Father!" "Adele, what's going on?" A faint voice replied from behind the jade wall. It sounded exhausted, but solemn. "The bloodstone has been broken," Adele, the Grand Elder, told her father faintly. "It doesn't matter. The bloodstone is extremely fragile. You may break it if you aren't careful enough. Besides, with so much wear and tear over so many years, I knew it'd break eventually. I'll make you a new one sometime soon," said the man in a light voice, clearly not taking the situation seriously. Adele frowned and continued, "The bloodstone broke, but not because someone dropped or smashed it." "Oh, really? How did it break, then?" the man asked in a more curious and eager tone. "Today, Giacomo brought a warrior back from the wilderness. He told me that the warrior had our race's blood, so I prepared the blood purity test in advance. Unexpectedly, when the stranger's blood was in the process of being tested, the bloodstone turned a deep, dark red and then broke suddenly." Adele explained to her father what had happened during Zen's blood purity test. "Are you telling me that the bloodstone actually broke during the blood purity test?" Her father's voice was now flat and serious. "The blood of an outsider can shatter the bloodstone. And what does that mean, exactly?" Adele asked curiously, her eyes wide. "It could only mean that the blood from the guy you tested is far beyond the 10th grade." The voice didn't sound exhausted or flat anymore, but contained a trace of excitement. Her father was clearly trying to control his tone. Adele was still puzzled as she asked for clarification. "Far beyond the 10th grade, you say? But father, you've told me before that our 9 Li race's blood only has 9 grades. Ha ha, and that's true. As for our race members, there are only 9 blood grades. The highest blood grade of the 9 Li members in this world can only be the 9th. The reason for such is because we are the exiles and our blood isn't very pure." Her father's voice revealed a hint of helplessness. Their blood had been inherited over generations and generations, from their parents and ancestors. Most of the Nine-Li people's blood, at least in this world, had been inherited from several Nine-Li exiles. Adele's father was an exile from the source world. Thus, Adele's blood was actually much purer than that of the other Nine-Li members. That said, if Adele married a member of the Nine-Li race and had a child, her child's blood wouldn't be as pure as hers. Although there was a chance that Adele's newborn child's blood might be better than hers, it was extremely slim. The baby would probably have a weaker bloodline. The bloodstone that I gave you can only test a warrior's blood up to the 10th grade, because no one in our race has blood that far surpasses the latter. I didn't expect that anyone would ever cause the bloodstone to break. I must go see this warrior, the voice said in a factual tone. Adele's eyebrows shot upward in surprise. Father, are you sure you want to come out of here? The man behind Jade Wall was silent for a brief moment, and then he smiled faintly. I'm one of the exiles and I've been cursed by the Chaos Ancient God. I can only survive if I hide here, in the Bone Tower. Cultivating in seclusion is just an excuse I've made. Boom, 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 boom. Cracks immediately appeared and spread on the surface of the Jade Wall. The whole Jade Wall rapidly collapsed, all at once. A bony middle-aged man appeared behind the Jade Wall's rebel. His gaze seemed calm, but he looked rather exhausted. In certain ways, he looked like Adele. As her eyes fell upon her father's appearance, Adele felt stunned. It had been countless years since the last time Adele had actually seen her father. Ever since she had been very young, she had known that her father was here, behind this Jade Wall. That said, she could only ever hear her father's voice. Never could she see him, not even once. When her mother died, her father still refused to leave the cover of this Jade Wall. The same rang true for the other exiles hiding within the Bone Tower. They had all sealed themselves inside the Jade Wall and rarely showed up anywhere, if at all. There was once a time when the Nine-Li race was in danger, and an exile had escaped the Bone Tower, taking immediate action. Adele remembered that the exile had revealed an incredible power, breaking hundreds of members from the Yellow Emperor race into pieces in the blink of an eye and thus dissolving the Nine-Li race's crisis. In other words, all this meant that her father wasn't actually forbidden from leaving the Jade Wall. He was just unwilling to do so. Adele took this matter to heart very seriously, all the time. After all, she had grown up and she still didn't even know what her father looked like. Never had she expected that her father would leave his precious Jade Wall just because Zen had broken the bloody stone. She was stunned and stared at her father's strange face. She couldn't believe what was happening. A bitter smile appeared on the middle-aged man's face. He walked up to touch Adele's fair, soft cheek and said faintly, "It's not that I didn't want to leave the Jade Wall. As the exiles, we're suffering from Chaos Ancient God's curse at all times. Our only option is to curl up here, in this small, solitary space." Oh, Adele blinked her eyes. She wasn't sure what to believe. Although her father's appearance came off strange to her, his voice was very familiar. After all, he was still her father, and he was trapped in this world without any way to escape. It wasn't before long that Adele caved and took her father to see Zen. Chapter 2153, The Imperial Grade Bloodline. Zen was still waiting in the square. The Nine-Li people didn't leave either, and once word of the broken bloodstone spread, even more of them had flocked to the square. The bloodstone was very important to the Nine-Li race. After all, the purity of its people's blood was tested by it. When that was determined, each member would be cultivated according to their blood purity. The purer their blood was, the more rewards they could receive and the more resources they could access. The bloodstone is broken. How will we hold the blood purity test in the future? Grand Elder will think of something, I'm sure. But where is she? Where has she been for so long? Whoosh! Two beams of light suddenly burst from the depths of the cave. Zen turned and saw Adele, followed closely by a middle-aged man. At first, he thought nothing of him. Taking a closer look, however, Zen recoiled, and his eyes flashed. The middle-aged man had hidden his cultivation base well, but Zen still sensed a strange aura emanating from him. Is this person an exile? Zen thought to himself. Almost immediately, Adele pointed at Zen and addressed the man with the peculiar aura. "Father, he is Zen Luo," she said loudly. The square fell silent again. Even Giacomo couldn't help but take a few steps back. Adele was the Grand Elder of the Nine-Li race, but it was clear that she was not the strongest among its members. The most powerful masters of the Nine-Li race were reclusive, spending most of their time hiding in the Bone Towers, and the chances of crossing paths with one of them were slim. No one knew how powerful those masters really were, but their secretive nature gave rise to many tales and legends. The most commonly told story was that one master had slaughtered hundreds of people of the Yellow Emperor race single-handedly. After all, many people had witnessed that horrible scene and lived to tell the tale. His eyes firmly fixed on Zen, the middle-aged man walked slowly towards him. After having scrutinized him for a while, he finally spoke. "If I am not wrong, you have already acquired the truth of godly way," he said coldly. As soon as these words had escaped the man's mouth, Zen's eyebrows shot up. There were many people in this world who could determine Zen's cultivation base and identify him as a true god, but the middle-aged man was a step ahead. His vision was so sharp that he could tell Zen had actually cultivated the truth of godly way. That's strange. If you have the blood of the 9 Li race, it should be very difficult for you to be taken in by other races, and bordering on impossible for you to learn the truth of godly way from those powerful humans. Where did you cultivate the truth of godly way? Do you even come from this world? Earlier, when the middle-aged man had heard Adele's words, he had already been very interested in Zen's origins. Now, he was completely overcome with curiosity. After all, the purity of Zen's blood was beyond his imagination. He had seen with his own eyes that Zen had the aura of the truth of godly way. That made it even more difficult to explain. In this world, almost all living beings mainly focused on cultivating the wild god system, relying on massive wild bones left over from the savage and wild times. Some did choose to cultivate the true god system, but they were few and far between. Under his guidance, Adele had opened up her inner world, and even condensed the godly tile, but she had not managed to go far along this path. The reason was that it was too difficult to become true gods in this world. In comparison, it was much easier to become wild gods, so the majority chose the latter. To his surprise, Zen had begun to comprehend the truth of godly way as a top-ranked true god. It was impossible for him to have come this far unless those powerful humans had taught him in person. How shrewd this man is. Zen was rather shocked in his heart. He hesitated, unsure how to react or answer. To his surprise, he didn't need to answer. The middle-aged man had read his mind. "Our race is extremely united in the source world," he said, his voice warm. "No matter where you have come from, as long as you do not harm us, we will treat you as family." Zen was silent for a while. "Can I not answer your question now?" he asked at last. "Sure," the middle-aged man replied with a smile. "But I need to test your blood purity again." The middle-aged man already had a few theories about Zen's background, but he still wanted to test Zen's blood purity to be absolutely sure. "Okay," said Zen, nodding and reaching out his hand to the middle-aged man again. The middle-aged man stretched out his hand and touched Zen's finger lightly. A drop of bright golden blood escaped from Zen's arm. Zen had no idea about the method the man had used to extract his blood in this way. When the middle-aged man saw the bright golden blood, his expression turned grave. Lightly, he flicked his hand. Tick-tock, a drop of blood shot from his fingertip and immediately merged with Zen's golden blood droplet. Then a small magic array emerged and covered the two men's blood, rotating in the air. A few moments later, the magic array suddenly seemed to burst with unparalleled power. It was as if there was a giant beast hiding inside that tiny blood drop. Then, the drop of red blood from the middle-aged man was completely devoured by Zen's golden blood drop. The middle-aged man's expression had, until now, been serene and content. Now, however, his smile abruptly faded away. His eyes seemed to blaze with light. He looked at Zen in disbelief and said excitedly, your blood." "Father, what's wrong?" asked Adele anxiously. She had never seen her father so excited. Giacomo and the others were also baffled by his reaction. After all, the middle-aged man, Adele's father, was a supreme existence in their race. They were lucky to have had the chance to see such a powerful man in their lifetimes. "What's wrong?" Zen asked with a frown. "How can you have an imperial-grade bloodline? How could it be possible?" The middle-aged man couldn't control his excitement any longer. He suddenly shouted, "Bro! Leopold, guess what I saw? Ha ha ha, I can't believe I found an imperial-grade bloodline. It's right here, right in this cage." His voice carried, and was heard in a cave far away. In the depths of that cave lived several exiles who had sealed themselves inside large jades and stayed there all the year round without making a sound. What is Ramsey talking about? The imperial-grade bloodline, is it a dream? There is the imperial-grade bloodline in this world. It's impossible. Let's go have a look. Clank, 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 the jades broke into pieces. The masters of the 9 Li race who had just broken their jade cages immediately transformed into beams of light and shot to the square. In no time, several figures appeared above the square, all of them looking down at Zen with curious expressions. The oldest among them asked, "Ramsey, are you sure this young man has the imperial grade bloodline of our race? Or did you make a mistake?" Chapter 2154, Overwhelming Salute. Ramsey looked at Zen with a complicated look on his face. In a daze, he said, "I was absolutely right. His blood is pure and powerful, and his drop of blood devoured mine completely just moments ago. Even my blood power can't resist his. Only the imperial grade bloodline can do that." The 9 Li race was divided into 9 tribes. That was how it got its name, in fact. The 9 tribes were each respectively called Beginning Yi, Square Yi, Yellow Yi, White Yi, Red Yi, Wind Yi, Mystery Yi, Sun Yi, and Field Yi. In the past, when the 9 Li race was at its most prosperous period, each tribe was viewed as a behemoth in the source world. Ramsey was a descendant of Wind Yi. Ramsey had given the 9 Li race in the Bone Tower a bloodstone and thus defined their bloodlines, ranging from 1st to 10th grade. Admittedly, even the 10th grade bloodlines weren't really considered a big deal in the source world. In point of fact, according to the bloodstone, Ramsey's bloodline was at about grade 13. Although testing his blood power using the bloodstone had been quite difficult, the power contained within his blood hadn't been enough to break the stone. Not even crack it. Therefore, when Adele had announced that the bloodstone had been broken during Zen's blood test, it was only normal that he felt very surprised. Only the 9 Li race's 81 mages had bloodlines of a higher grade than Ramsey's. Their bloodlines could be considered of the 14th grade. That said, it didn't mean that their blood, despite being a higher grade, could devour Ramsey's easily. He might not be the strongest in terms of strength among these exiles, but he did have the highest grade blood power among them. And only imperial grade bloodlines could devour his blood with ease. After hearing Ramsey out, the old man stared at Zen for a brief moment before asking, "Kid, who are your parents?" First and foremost, Zen didn't completely trust the 9 Li members. He was always wary of everyone, and in his mind, he always held on to a few misgivings. Ultimately, he was worried that these warriors had been taken to the prison because they had betrayed their race or had committed a grave mistake. However, upon entering the Bone Tower, he quickly noticed that the warriors here still treated Chiyu as their leader. Everyone who walked in would kneel down before him in worship. Zen's worries gradually dissipated. "My mother's name is Lorena," Zen stated in a low voice. "Lorena, is that right?" the old man asked in reply, completely lost in thought. "It seems to me that there is no such person in 9 Li race by that name. Nor have I even ever heard of anyone in the royal family named Lorena." "Leopold, have you heard of this name anywhere before?" asked another man. Leopold was the youngest among the group. He had maintained his youthful appearance for countless years, and among the 9 Li exiles, he was the last to be taken to this prison. As he heard Zen speak, Leopold descended silently from midair where he was hovering, and knelt down on one knee in front of him. The other exiles looked at one another, clearly confused by what was going on. Even though Zen was of the imperial grade bloodline, there was no reason for Leopold to be so courteous toward him. His behavior was unexpected. "Leopold, what do you think you're doing?" Ramsey asked in bewilderment. Leopold slowly looked up at Zen and said, "Before I was exiled, the royal family gave birth to a new female baby. The heavy rain fell on Jade Toad Mountain. The female baby was named Lorena. She is Grand Chieftain's youngest daughter. Grand Chieftain was so happy he ordered the 9 tribes to celebrate the baby's birth for 3 consecutive months." As they heard what Leopold had to say, everyone immediately felt stunned. They all stared blankly at Zen, and everyone had fallen mysteriously silent. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Before long, every single one of the exiles floating in the air had descended and was kneeling down silently in front of Zen. They were all on one knee, as though they were proposing. If this was all just because Zen had the imperial grade bloodline, then it was clearly too much. He wasn't worthy of such behavior. There was a great difference, though, if Zen was Chiyu's grandson. Even Adele, the grand elder of the 9 Li race, knelt down without hesitation as soon as she saw her father doing so. The elders, including Giacomo and Eric, all knelt down in front of Zen, too. They worshipped him and paid him their respects. "Dad, who is that man? He must be important. Why does everyone kowtow to him? Don't ask too many questions, my little boy. Just lower your head like everyone else." The people around the square were all confused, of course, but they all prostrated themselves on the ground without a word of disagreement. Now, only Zen could be seen standing throughout the entire square. Zen felt very uncomfortable with their sudden, overwhelming salute. This, he began. Everyone, just please stand up. He raised his tone of voice. As Zen exclaimed loudly, the oldest man among them slowly got to his feet and stared at Zen with a sad, indignant expression on his face. Has our 9 Li race lost the battle? He asked. Why has the Grand Chieftain's grandchild also been exiled to this world? In his eyes, the 9 Li race's royal family were the pride and joy of the entire race. Among those children, the descendants of Chiyu, the Grand Chieftain, were respected the most. Despite that, though, now, even the Grand Chieftain's grandson had been exiled into this world. One could imagine how difficult the 9 Li race's current situation really was. Leopold spoke to Zen. Before I was exiled, the 9 Li race had been in grave danger. It was even said that Grand Chieftain wanted to fight against Yellow Emperor in Guild Town. But I was exiled before that. And I know nothing of what happened after that. Please, tell us. Inform us all. Zen understood. They thought that he too had been exiled to this world. Zen froze and was silent for a moment as he realized that these people had misunderstood him. He then clarified, I haven't been exiled into this world. What, you weren't exiled here? The oldest man was surprised. Then how did you get to this world? He questioned. The others looked at each other, puzzled expressions pulling at their features. Other than being exiled, was there really any other way to enter this world? This place was incredibly far from the source world, and with Zen's cultivation base, it was even less possible for him to cross such a long distance. In the crowd, someone's eyes lit up as the person asked, did you travel here with the ship above Torrent Bone Tower? The wild gods in the world had detected that ship a long time ago, at least. They were fully aware of its existence. At the time of its discovery, they had noticed that the giant ship was landing at an extremely fast speed, and it was estimated that it would crash into the world in just a few years. No one knew who had built the ship exactly, but all the races had been preparing for its crash. As soon as it did, they had the intentions of rushing up and plundering everything within. The resources within this world were extremely rare. Other than relying on the wild bones for cultivation, nearly no other cultivation resources existed here. Every race paid close attention to the ship and a detailed plan had been put together by the 9 Li race. They had determined the exact spot of the ship's landing, and they were always ready to go and collect a few benefits from it. However, not long ago, an accident had occurred on the ship and it had soared up into the air, above the chaos, in a matter of seconds. At that time, the Snake Goddess race, which was the most powerful race in this world, had bound the ship above the Torrent Bone Tower. The oldest man and Ramsey, along with Leopold, all kept a close watch on Zen. It was highly possible that Zen had arrived here through the ship. Yes, Zen nodded in a simple reply. My mother told me that the ship was created by Chiyu himself. I wasn't born in the source world, but on that ship. As for the source world's current situation, it's almost the same as what you have been led to believe. The 9 Li race has indeed been defeated, and for this reason, my grandfather made the ship so that the warriors could escape. As Zen explained the truth, the exiles quickly changed the looks on their faces. Chapter 2155, Discussion. The 9 Li race really has been defeated. All of the exiles had a sad expression on their faces. If we've been defeated by the Yellow Emperor, where's the Grand Chieftain? And the 81 mages, and the many 9 Li guards? The eldest man stared at Zen. Zen shook his head. I don't know. I only know that this ship carries the hope of the 9 Li race and that there are a lot of 9 Li members. This is a ship for escape. How could this happen? It's impossible that the 9 Li race was defeated by the Yellow Emperor. Brother, I want to go out and kill all the Yellow Emperor members. One shouted in anger. It wasn't the members of the Yellow Emperor race in this world who caused the destruction of the 9 Li race. The people in this world were only exiles cursed by the Chaos Ancient God. It was just that they were shocked by the news and couldn't suppress their anger. Don't be impulsive. The old man took a deep breath to calm himself. Since it's the Grand Chieftain that created the ship, why is it falling? Because this ship was hunted down by the Yellow Emperor guards, Zen spoke softly. The 9 Li members on the ship have all almost been cleanly killed off. Since they were so angry, Zen didn't plan to tell them at first, but because they asked, he could only tell them the truth. Yellow Emperor guards. Even though he was calm earlier, the old man was once again agitated. It's my fault that I didn't wipe out those Yellow Emperor guards back then. I only ended about 100 Yellow Emperor guards. 100 Yellow Emperor guards? The words shocked Zen. Zen didn't know the number of Yellow Emperor guards. There was a time that his mother mentioned that there were over 100,000 9 Li guards in the 9 Li race and the Yellow Emperor guards should be about the same. This old man alone was able to kill over 100 Yellow Emperor guards. How strong was he? After the 9 Li people were slaughtered, the divine land was gradually occupied by the human race, and then. Previously, Zen didn't want to say anything. Since Zen had decided to trust these exiles, he would tell them everything. Once Zen finished, everyone remained silent. It was silent until Ramsey asked, "So you were the one who changed the ship's direction?" "Yes." Ramsey turned to the old man. "What should we do now?" Everyone looked at the old man for guidance. He was the strongest of all the exiles as well as the strongest in the 9 Li race in this world. Even in the source world, he wasn't someone that could be ignored. At the beginning, they had desperately hoped that the ship would fall off so that they could get a share of the ship, but now, they were worried about the ship's fate. But the old man stared at Zen, his eyes filled with hesitation. In the end, he heaved a deep sigh. The wrinkles on his face deepened and he looked much older in an instant. "I'm old and it's fine for me to sacrifice my life for the 9 Li race, but one can only enter this world and there's no way to get out. What can I do?" The old man sighed. As long as there was a tiny bit of news coming from the source world, the exiles would be very excited. It had been many years since the last exile came and they had completely lost their means to learn about the source world. Even if they had no information, they were always worried about the safety of the 9 Li race. The news Zen brought made them desperate, but Zen, who was in front of them, let them see the chance to do something for the 9 Li race. The problem was that this world was a huge prison. What could they do when they were trapped here? The old man's words made their eyes dim even further. "However, we have to let the snake goddess race release the ship and let it leave," Ramsey suddenly said. "That's right. No matter how strong snake goddess race are, there's no way they could have their hands on the ship." Another exile resolutely spoke up. In this world, the snake goddess race had absolute command. Not only were they naturally powerful because of their bloodline, they also had a few extremely formidable exiles. They naturally dominated the world. The old man interrupted them. "Have you thought of what Zen has in mind?" Zen must have come up with his own ideas. The group of excited exiles stared at Zen again. It was time for him to make a decision. Zen swept his gaze through the crowd for a quiet moment before he faintly began to speak. "My mother had no choice but to send me out. When I first came to this world, I had only one thought, and that was to become stronger, and then I will go back to kill them. I won't fight my way only to the divine land but all the way to the source world too." As soon as these words came out of his mouth, a hint of smile appeared on the exiles' faces. It was arrogant for Zen to boast about his goals with his current strength, but he was a member of the 9 Li race and the grandson of Chiyu. If he didn't even have the guts to think like this, then their race would really be hopeless. "With your bloodline, it won't be difficult for you to become strong in this world. But I'm afraid it's still impossible to return and kill them all. No one can leave here." The majority of these exiles were powerful warriors at the other shore realm. How could they be willingly trapped in this world? They tried almost every way and still, no one managed to leave the world. This was a one-way world, one could only enter and there was no way for them to leave. The old man had planned to say that Lorena shouldn't have sent Zen here. But on second thought, Lorena was the daughter of the Grand Chieftain, and he was in no place to blame her. Moreover, she had no other choice because she sent Zen here to save his life. Other exiles also looked depressed. At this moment, with just a blink of an eye, Zen used chaotic energy to send a voice message to the exiles' ears. "What if I know how to get back?" It puzzled Ramsey, the old man, Leopold and a few others why Zen had to be so secretive in giving his message. "What do you mean?" the old man asked back secretly. "Have you heard of the Warden race?" Zelda had once told Zen that the Warden race were searching for her and her brother all over the world. Since this Warden race ruled this prison, it was likely they had spies everywhere. Because he had just entered the 9 Li race and was unfamiliar with the situation, he had to be careful or it would be troublesome if there were people from the Warden race present. Hearing Zen mention the Warden race, the exiles looked at each other again. "You've just entered this world. Why do you know the Warden race?" the old man asked doubtfully. Very few people in this world knew the existence of the Light of Adjudication, and the people who knew the mysterious Warden race were even rarer. It hadn't even been a year since he came in this world and he had spent most of it in the wilderness outside the Bone Towers, so how could he know these things? Chapter 2156, An Opportunity to Break Out of Prison. The masters who were exiled here wouldn't yield easily. Over the years, they had tried every means to leave this place, but they still couldn't get rid of the restraints on their bodies. It felt like they were doomed to just stay and wait for death to come, but they shouldn't be stuck with no choice. As soon as Zen appeared, they saw a ray of light, a little hope to what they were trying to figure out. He was going to tell them a way to escape this world. It was something the exiles naturally thought was inconceivable. If it weren't for Zen's special identity, they would have already driven him out and wouldn't give him the chance to speak. His presence stirred up the place, causing doubts and confusion. When I first entered this world, I encountered 2 members of the warden race, Zen said calmly to the group of exiles. Thinking for a moment, the oldest man said, though they are the managers of this world, the warden race rarely appears. Even if they show up, they usually disguise themselves by using the phantom theurgy. This way, ordinary people won't notice their existence at all. Are you sure you have met them? The warden race, as its name suggested, was the warden of the prison, making these exiles their prisoners. They were tasked to watch over and make sure no one would escape. These prisoners did everything and would do unimaginable things in order to get out of this prison. If the people of the warden race randomly appeared, they would be instantly torn into pieces by the exiles. In fact, some exiles secretly investigated the lair of the warden race, hoping this would give them a way out of prison, but got nothing. The warden race usually had regular visits planned. Every hundreds of years, they would secretly inspect the bone towers of each race, disguising as phantoms every time. That way, only the powerful exiles could perceive their arrival, and the rest remained clueless. Yes, I'm sure it was them. Zen nodded. How can you prove it? The oldest man asked, looking at Zen. They showed me the curse chain, Zen replied. And I saw it myself, he said in a sure tone. Upon hearing this remark from Zen, all the exiles took a deep breath. The biggest constraint in this prison was the curse chain. It was what had been holding them locked up in this world. Even the oldest man, who clearly had supreme strength, could not do anything to cut loose from this invisible curse chain. Feeling confused, Leopold finally stepped up and asked, I'm curious. Why did the warden race contact you? As the manager of this world, the purpose of the warden race was to ensure that no one could leave the prison. To date, Leopold had made countless attempts to communicate with them, but they had always been silent and non-responsive. Hearing Leopold's doubts, the others were also unable to hide their confusion. They thought Zen was making up a story. They couldn't believe he would be lucky enough to see 2 wardens. Because of the disputes within the warden race, some of them wanted to escape, Zen replied. But getting out was never easy. The faction that tried to escape failed, leaving only a girl and her brother. Since he mentioned it already, Zen ended up telling them everything about Zelda and Luther. The exiles listened as Zen relayed all the information that he had gathered so far. After he finished, he looked around and found all of them standing still in silence. They were pondering over what Zen said, unable to hide its complexity with their own facial expressions. At least, Zen's statement was logical, and it helped them verify something they had theories about in the past. For example, Zelda told Zen that the warden race was chasing them. Within this 1,000 years, the warden race frequently visited the bone towers of the different races. In the past, they appeared once every 200 or 300 years only, but for some reason, they had appeared more than 100 times in the recent decades. Why? Ramsey, Leopold and other masters had also speculated on the unusual action of the warden race. They wondered if something had happened in this world. Otherwise, why would the wardens be wasting time doing these unnecessary rounds? The masters were left to figure out a reason on their own. The warden race was not expected to communicate with the exiles at all, so there was no way for them to figure out what had happened. Now that Zen mentioned it, it seemed that the warden race constantly visited the bone towers to look for this girl and her brother. All the exiles wanted was to run away from this world. Some had actually tried everything they could think of, hoping they would succeed. However, it was totally impossible for them to escape the prison built by the Chaos Ancient God. After a long while, the oldest man opened his mouth to break the silence. If what Zen said is true, this is probably a great opportunity for us. Also, it is an opportunity we have never known before and never to occur again. Zen, you are indeed a descendant of the Grand Chieftain. A real son of heaven. You've met such a great opportunity, Ramsey exclaimed, unable to contain his excitement. Then, shall we bring the girl and her brother into our bone tower first? One of the exiles suggested anxiously. He knew that the siblings were being sought. If the warden race found and took away Zelda and Luther, this rare opportunity would probably disappear. Zen just observed and decided not to say anything. After all, these exiles were more familiar with their world than he was. After thinking for a long time, the oldest man finally continued to ask Zen, are the girl and her brother in danger now? They are staying in a tribe on the edge of the immemorial wilderness right now. So for the time being, they are safe, Zen assured him. For many years, Zelda and Luther had stayed in the Iron Tribe, and Zen had just helped them eliminate the Macon tribe. Zelda's status was very stable, so as long as there was no accident, they would be safe. That's good. There's still 3 years left before the light of adjudication comes. We still have time. Until the right time comes, let's not act rashly and alert the enemy. The oldest man made a decision. I'll get in touch with the other races, such as the Snake Goddess race, the Flame race, and the Heavenly Joy race, so we can put our heads together and make the perfect plan. He knew that leaving this world was not only the dream of the Nine-Li race, but the dream of all the exiles. They would need all the help they could get if they wanted to succeed. Once they knew the way out of this world, the Warden race wouldn't be able to stop them. Adele, Giacomo, Eric and the others saw Zen and the masters quietly communicating with each other. Confused as to what important things they were plotting, they couldn't understand why they were talking so secretly and carefully. At this moment, a person from the Nine-Li race came. Grand Elder, some special envoys from the Yellow Emperor race come to ask for a meeting. As soon as he finished with the announcement, he noticed that all of the powerful masters of his race had left the cave and come to the square. Stunned, he remained standing there in a daze for a while, not knowing what just happened. It was difficult for him to see any one of them in thousands of years. But today, for some strange reason, all of them appeared at the same time. Why? Looking at the reporter, Adele asked, they come for the Sky South Bone Tower, right? Yes, they come to deliver a challenge in writing, the clansman answered. I knew they would not let go of this so easily. Adele's face was covered with a layer of cold air. Upon hearing this, Giacomo and Eric also frowned. The exiles would not deal with the affairs in the race by themselves. So as the Grand Elder, Adele was in charge of everything. However, this time, after agreeing to sign the bet with the Yellow Emperor race, her race had lost 2 talented warriors and fell into a passive position. It was her mistake and it made her very angry. Let Adele deal with the matters of our race, the oldest man advised, watching her from afar. Other than matters concerning their own lives, the exiles wouldn't participate in the fights between the wild gods. They naturally chose to avoid getting involved in these things whenever they could. Chapter 2157, David. Wait, Adele abruptly cried out. Ramsay looked at his daughter and asked, what's wrong, Adele? Adele's beautiful eyes gazed at Zen, flashing with a hint of complexity. Giacomo brought Zen back because of the extraordinary strength he had displayed before Romeo. He was deemed to be eligible in participating in the battle between the 2 races. It was quite unexpected that Zen had the imperial-grade bloodline. Would he still be suitable to join the battle? In the battle for the Sky South Bone Tower, Chandler and Farhan have been killed by Yellow Emperor race. Our chances of winning in the battle are very small. This time, I hope that Zen can fight the battle, Adele directly voiced out her intention. Before Ramsay could say anything, the oldest man smiled faintly and stated, if Zen wants to become stronger, cultivating the wild god system in this world is a shortcut, and he can give full play to his blood power. He can fight as long as his safety is ensured. The exiles were far-sighted. Zen was just a top-rank true god, but it seemed that he had already comprehended 2 truths of godly ways. His soul was far more powerful than that of an ordinary wild god. Fighting against the mid-rank wild gods would not be too difficult for him with his strength. Besides, he had enough time to absorb the blood wild bones in the Nine-Li race. A smile appeared on Adele's face as she heard the words from the oldest man. She nodded in understanding and said, I see. After the exiles departed, Adele gave out an order to summon the envoys of Yellow Emperor race. Shortly, several beams of light flew from the sky. A group of people showed themselves before them. The leader of the group had fair skin, dashing eyebrows and starry eyes. His face showed an expression full of pride. He was only a mid-rank wild god given his cultivation base, but he didn't appear nervous at all being in the territory of the Nine-Li race. He spotted Adele but didn't show any respect. He casually took out a jade page and gently flipped it towards Adele. He then muttered arrogantly, catch it. This is the letter of challenge of our race. How dare you, how dare you. Giacomo, Eric and the other clansmen burst into anger seeing how the young man acted arrogantly before Adele. Adele wasn't affected at all. Her expression was as calm as usual. With a flick of her slender fingers, she took over the jade page. She glanced at it and said in an emotionless voice, you've already decided the candidates. How confident you are. The young man smiled and said, my race is the ruler of this world, so we are surely confident. We have designated 5 people to fight, but in my opinion, it's such a waste of time. I, David, alone will be enough. So you are David of the Yellow Emperor race, Eric spoke with a frown on his face. A highly talented man had appeared in the Yellow Emperor race. It was said that the whole race used all their resources in order to train him. Interesting. Why did your race send you to deliver the letter of challenge? Giacomo raised his eyebrows and asked meaningfully, aren't you afraid of death? The 9 race had suffered a great loss because of the bet the 2 race had made. The Yellow Emperor race killed Chandler and Farhan from their race, which left them in grim grievance. Needless to say, the 9 race would take revenge by all means. It never occurred to them that the Yellow Emperor race dared to send David to deliver the letter of challenge. My father has said that you don't dare to hurt me, David said calmly. Oh really? I'll kill you right now. Eric's aura suddenly rose up. He was like a wild ancient beast ready to pounce on a human to feast on. As an elder of the 9 race, Eric's strength was almost on par with that of Giacomo. He was considered to be capable of killing a mid-rank wild god. David felt the oppression from Eric's aura and couldn't help but take 2 steps back. Despite the pressure, he still had a faint smile and spoke without fear, you can try. Okay, Eric was a man with a violent temper. How could he tolerate a young man who dared provoke him? Seeing that he was about to attack, Adele stretched out her hand and stopped him. She said, the Yellow Emperor race killed our people in the immemorial wilderness. According to our agreement, it was allowed. So if we kill him here, it will be unreasonable. But, Eric couldn't accept to resign to calm down his annoyance. Adele looked back at David and said, I've received your letter of challenge. 3 months later, my 9 race will accept the battle. You can leave now. David looked at Adele with a look of disappointment. He purposely meant to provoke the 9 race as he came to deliver the letter of challenge on behalf of his race. He didn't expect that Adele would be so calm as if she didn't take their upcoming battle seriously. It left him a little disappointed. Before leaving, David laughed and said, I hope that the losers of your race don't disappoint me in the battle. Zen, who had been silent all the time, slightly frowned upon hearing David's arrogant words. Wait, Adele's indifferent voice rang out. What's wrong? David turned around and asked. Clap. Everyone did not see how Adele made her move, but a clear 5 fingerprints had already been left on David's face. Adele raised her hand and spoke in a cold voice, you are an envoy from the Yellow Emperor race, so I can't kill you. But you're rude to me and my people, so I have to teach you a lesson. Go back and learn how to behave yourself from your elders. Adele was the grand elder of the 9 race, and so her strength was incredibly strong, being only second to that of the exiles in her race. The force of her slap was indeed great. The 5 fingerprints had become more prominent in an instant, and half of David's face had been swollen. David expected a burst of pain. He touched his face and gently moistened his lips. Grand Elder, you are right. I'll remember your lesson. After finishing his words, he left resolutely straight ahead without looking back. What an arrogant guy. Giacomo looked at their retreating backs sullenly. Let me kill him halfway. Eric urged. No need for that. He did it on purpose. The Yellow Emperor race must have been prepared. Adele shook her head. Rather than get angry with such a guy, it's better to prepare for the upcoming battle. We can't lose. She then turned to Zen and instructed, you have to cultivate with Elsa, Romeo, and Killian these days. I will give you enough cultivation resources. 3 months later, you will fight the battle on behalf of our 9 race. Zen smiled and nodded. The 9 race was one of the top 3 races in this world. They had stored a massive amount of wild bones, which was an unimaginable number for ordinary wild gods. However, in time, the blood wild bones of any great race were in short supply. They were distributed according to the clansman's blood purity and the talent shown. Even so, the clansman still got a small number of blood wild bones. A talent like Romeo could only obtain dozens of blood wild bones a year. But the situation made things different. As Zen had the imperial grade bloodline, all the restrictions of distributing the blood wild bones weren't taken into consideration anymore. Chapter 2158, Body Tribulations. There were 2 particular sections that divided the 9 race. The ordinary 9 members used the outer area as a residence, while the inner layer served as their venue for cultivation. People who filled the place were the most outstanding warriors of the 9 race. Grow. On a spacious muster station by the side of a cultivation place, a figure of a young man could be seen growing by the minute. In just a blink of an eye, that same man's body had increased hundreds of times bigger than it already was. In such a short time, he managed to grow up to about 300 to 400 feet tall. Hey, With his now larger extremities, the boy began bellowing and kicking in the air. He then casually kicked up a stone lock on the side of the muster station. Each stone lock was extremely heavy and was exceptionally tall like a mountain. When the young man finally seized the stone lock, his expression turned feral. Loads of younger 9Li members stared in awe as the figure hovered over them. Wow, Kirin never fails to impress. Indeed, they say Kirin is to undergo the body tribulations. Once he's through with the process, he would be able to use the 9Li wild body then. What a powerful 6th grade bloodline. In the past thousands of years, Kirin was the second wild god who possessed the 6th grade blood in the Chiyu race. Obtaining such a talent wasn't easy for the 9Li race, that was why they trained him to the best of their abilities. However, Kirin was too young to represent the 9Li race during fights. Phew. Accompanied by Giacomo, Zen slowly walked towards Kirin who was playing with the stone lock. With a hint of admiration in his eyes, Zen said, "This kid sure is young, but he already has reached such a level. A young 9Li talent, indeed." Besides the exiles, the people Zen had seen since he entered the 9Li race were also rather complex beings. Even ordinary 9Li warriors were stronger than wild gods in the outside, let alone someone with the likes of Eric and Giacomo. Their strength could altogether sweep through a city in one swift move. He still has a long way to go. We all know how hard it is to cultivate in the wild god system, said Giacomo. Zen only nodded in agreement. Even if he had cultivated the wild god power as a shortcut, he knew quite well that it wasn't easy to succeed in this path. With just one wave of the stone lock, Kirin's movement sped up. He went on like a madman until his body lost its balance. What's up with that? This boy. Upon seeing that, Giacomo realized that something terrible was about to happen. Despite the rapid progress that Kirin had made during his cultivation, it was inevitable that during the process when wild gods cultivated, their bodies would constantly expand. It would take a certain time for them to adapt to such a drastic body size increase. After all, everyone's perception of size rooted in their experiences. Even activities like walking could become a challenge for some of the wild gods that had absorbed enough wild god power and had their body sizes doubled. For Kirin, it was the same problem. Bang! Kirin dropped to the ground with a roaring thud. Such an impact caused the entire muster station to shake. Almost as if it was precisely calculated, the mountain-sized stone lock crashed into the other side where dozens of 9Li younglings gathered. Those kids didn't activate the wild god power in their bodies at that certain time. The weight of the stone lock could be unbearable for them. Upon impact, they all could turn into a puddle of meat paste. This doesn't look good. Whoosh. At that moment, Giacomo had already conjured up the wild god power in his body. In just a short amount of time, his body doubled in size. Without second thoughts, he rushed towards the falling stone lock. Despite the short distance between him and the stone lock, he was too late. It all happened too fast. Dumbfounded by the events that unfolded before him, Kirin could only stare blankly at the moving stone as he sat on the bumpy ground. As he thought of the worst possibilities that could happen, he closed his eyes. It was clear to Zen that the stone lock was getting closer and closer to the young 9Li members, and he had also noticed that Giacomo wasn't able to catch up with it. Zen stretched his arm and for a second, it looked like he was grabbing onto the air. Boom! It sounded like the stone lock had hit an invisible wall. It suddenly began to fall down vertically. Crack! Due to the collision, countless cracks began to appear on the surface of the stone lock. Finally, it broke into a heap of debris that quickly scattered all over the ground below. Both Giacomo and Kirin stopped dead in their tracks. What? Giacomo couldn't even form a coherent sentence. The young 9Li members who initially thought they were doomed were now stunned by what they had just witnessed. Now that is pure and genuine strength. Giacomo's eyes glinted in surprise. With a hint of disbelief in his voice, he turned to Zen and said, "So you can actually use your power to such an extent, huh?" In terms of power, the strength source that Zen had just used wasn't enough to catch Giacomo's attention. However, it was still impressive. If they were in the same realm, the power of a wild god was still considered stronger than that of a true god. The truth of the matter was, once the wild god power was completely fused into a cultivator's body, it was impossible to separate them. It was a pure body refining method, and extracting the power from the body was unachievable. Zen could use the strength source of the 9 divine stars. Furthermore, he was able to comprehend the power shaping, the Thirgy beyond way. He could control the invisible power as he pleased. That kind of control over colossal power left Giacomo in awe. "I was aching to save those boys. Forgive me for that," Zen said. With a gentle wave of his finger, the wall manifested by the strength source instantly dissipated. Uncle Giacomo, I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. Kieran sounded frantic. If he killed more than a dozen of his fellowmen, it would have been unforgivable. With furrowed eyebrows and a hard look, Giacomo retorted, don't make the same mistake again. Be more careful. I understand. Kieran blinked a few times and left with the other younglings. Meanwhile, Giacomo wasn't able to get over the strength Zen had displayed. They decided to advance for a while, walking past the muster station. As they made their way, tall warehouses began to appear one by one. Those things extended to a distance and there might have been 1,000 of them. Just as they approached the warehouses, Zen began to feel an intense wild god power radiating from those high buildings. Are wild bones stored in these warehouses? Zen asked. Yes, they are, Giacomo responded, nodding his head softly. That's a lot of wild bones. Zen exclaimed, a little taken aback. The warehouses that stood before him were probably thousands of feet high, just how many wild bones could be stored in them? It surprised Zen to know that the resources owned by the Nine Li race were beyond his comprehension. There are just too many wild bones and they are not very meaningful for his Nine Li race, Giacomo said flatly. After all, the wild god power that everyone can absorb is limited. We ultimately have to face the body tribulations once the amount of wild god power we have absorbed has reached a certain level. If we can't go through the body tribulations, our cultivation won't improve regardless of how many wild bones we have absorbed. Body tribulations. Zen was astounded. What kind of tribulation is that? Of course, he had heard about the life and death tribulation, and heavenly tribulation. However, he wasn't familiar with anything like body tribulations. The puzzled look on Giacomo's face surprised Zen beyond belief. He then asked in complete bewilderment, do you really not have the slightest idea of what the body tribulations are? Chapter 2159, Herbert. Zen was a stranger to this world. He had learned most of what he knew about the wild gods from Zelda, as well as the method of absorbing the wild bones and extracting the wild god power. Moreover, he also knew about the blood wild bones in the Sand Core City. However, he did not yet have a complete understanding of these things. He only knew that he could increase his strength by devouring the wild bones and absorbing the wild god power therein. If someone possessed the blood of a certain race, they could then exclusively absorb the blood wild bones of that race and obtain the talents contained within that blood. That was the sum of Zen's knowledge on the matter. I just started to cultivate the wild god system. As for the body tribulations that must be faced, I really don't know anything about them, Zen said, shaking his head. Giacomo gazed at Zen for a long while and then his surprise gave way to a smile. The wild god system is not merely about body refining. If you practice in the extreme, you would be able to cross the shore and reach the other shore realm. Actually, the wild god system is also known as the ancient god cultivation method. I can reach the other shore realm through intense cultivation of the wild god system. Zen's eyes flashed at the promise. Giacomo nodded. Grand Elder instructed us in this. Those powerful exiles had been forced to this world by the Chaos Ancient God. At the very beginning, they couldn't live for 1,000 years. Whenever the light of adjudication came, the prisoners kept in the prison would be purified and emptied. But after the bone towers appeared, the exiles found a way to survive, and they began to form their own races. Gradually, this empty world had become lively, and the races had proliferated in their diversity. At first, the exiles were inclined to encourage their clansmen to cultivate the true god system, but soon they discovered that this world wasn't suitable for cultivating this system. It was easy for the exiles to extract life vitality from the chaotic energy, but for the warriors who had just started to practice, it proved extremely difficult, despite the fact that they were born as extraordinary creatures and were able to survive at the bottom of the chaos. The strong warriors who had been exiled to this world by the Chaos Ancient God had not been weaklings in the Source world. The discovery was quickly made that there was a massive amount of wild bones here. The origin of these wild bones could even have dated back to the early stage of chaos, and the sheer number of these wild bones was unimaginable. So these exiles thought of the body refining cultivation method that was passed down from ancient times, namely the ancient god cultivation method. Why don't the warriors in the Source world practice this cultivation method? Zen asked curiously. Almost all the warriors that Zen had come into contact with were cultivating the true god system. It seemed that even Harper had successfully cultivated the true god system and had therefore reached the other shore realm. Well, Zen's question stumped Giacomo, who was at a loss for words. Giacomo was born in this world. He was not from the Source world. These things had come down through a very long history, so it was naturally difficult for him to explain this in layman's terms. There are no such cultivation resources in the source world, so those warriors can only choose the grand world cultivation method instead of the ancient god cultivation method, an ancient voice suddenly said behind them. Hearing the wizened voice, Zen and Giacomo both turned their heads and saw that the oldest man had appeared behind them. Giacomo was about to bow respectfully when he saw the oldest man. The oldest man waved his hand and said, "Don't bother with the niceties. I'm here to see Zen. The grand world cultivation method you said is the method to cultivate the true God system?" Zen asked, still puzzled. "Yes, you're right," the oldest man replied with a smile. Zen pondered over this for a while, and a strange expression settled on his face. Does that then mean that the ancient gods also needed to cultivate with the wild bones? In other words, the source world used to also contain a huge amount of wild bones then? "Yes, you're quite correct," the oldest man said, pleased at Zen's agile mind. After absorbing all of the wild bones in the source world, those warriors then became the ancient gods. The newcomers didn't have the wild bones as cultivation sources. As a result, they ended up creating the grand world cultivation method, namely the true God system. Am I right? Zen asked, carefully expressing his train of thought. Yes, you're absolutely correct. The oldest man exclaimed, "You're so smart to have understood that. You're indeed the grandson of the Grand Chieftain." The oldest man sighed slightly and then added, "There was once a land of wilderness in the source world. Like this world, there were also huge amounts of wild bones there, but all of them had been dug up and claimed." Although the oldest man repeatedly confirmed what he had suspected, Zen's expression became more and more guarded. He then asked another question, "Where do the countless wild bones in the source world and this world originally come from?" "I knew you would ask this question." The oldest man had already expected it, so he replied lightly, "That involves the chaos ancient gods, and that is also the ultimate question of the whole chaos. There are some talents that never show up among the populations in the source world, and they have been seeking the answers to this question for countless years." Zen frowned slightly. He had not expected that his casual question would have led to the divulging of such complicated things. The behavior of the chaos ancient gods has always been unpredictable, especially that of Herbert. He was the one who built the prison and was said to be incomparably powerful, but every time he descended, he would bring about some unimaginable events. Sometimes he would surprise the warriors, and sometimes he would scare them. The oldest man sighed and continued, "The bones are said to be our backups. Our bones may be hidden somewhere in this world." Zen blinked his eyes as an incomprehensible look settled on his face. This was too much for a mere warrior to understand, and all that he could comprehend was that the chaos ancient god who had built the prison was called Herbert. Giacomo, who stood next to Zen, was also completely stunned by these revelations. "Our backups?" Zen asked in bewilderment as the implications of this information struggled through his thoughts. The oldest man nodded. "Yes, each white corresponds to a living creature within the chaos. Once a white dies, there will be one more skeleton added to the immemorial wilderness. However, these whites are only our backups. It's impossible for you to know exactly which white is your backup." "Then why did Herbert do all of this?" Zen asked. "Why don't you go ask him?" the oldest man suggested with a smile. Zen couldn't help but smile. These questions were truly not what he had expected from this conversation. The oldest man looked around the warehouses and said, "It's extremely painful to cultivate using the ancient god cultivation method. If we accept what was said in the ancient times, we can use our body strength to pass through the sea of truth and reach the other shore realm, but no one living has succeeded in this world. Even in the source world, other than the ancient gods, no one has ever succeeded. If you are willing to explore this method, then we, the Nine Li race, will do everything in our power to help you." Zen's eyes flashed with insight when he heard the oldest man's words. Currently, he lacked the strength for this task. No matter how his father had planned his own growth in the past, Zen might not be able to take what would happen to him into consideration now. After all, he had met with too many accidents once he had stepped into the divine land. Now an accident had again caused him to be sent to this world by his mother. Still, he would follow this path laid before him without hesitation. Chapter 2160, Cave of Wildness. If Zen's news was true and the exiles could leave this world, then the dispute between the Nine Li race and the Yellow Emperor race would no longer matter. The Bone Towers were fortresses, but who in their right mind would stay willingly in that place forever? The oldest man among them wanted to make Zen stronger in hopes that he'd be able to take them back to the source world one day. "I'd face any obstacle and experience every pain if it means getting stronger," Zen proclaimed. The old man only smiled and turned to Giacomo. Let Zen absorb the wild bones first. When the body tribulations arrive, give him 10 shares of blood wild bones. 10 shares of blood wild bones? Giacomo asked in disbelief. Can he endure them? 10 shares of blood wild bones didn't mean just 10 blood wild bones. Blood wild bones were very precious in the outside world as well as in the Nine Li race. And because of the value they held, one would think that there was a scarcity of them. But in truth, if the blood wild bones were distributed according to the blood purity of 9 Li members, there would be enough for everyone and more. This was because very few could handle their power. For instance, even though Romeo was a genius of the 5th grade bloodline, he could only use 2 shares of blood wild bones. It was also said that Adele only used 3 shares to undergo the body tribulations in the past. Otherwise, the burst of the body tribulations would be too powerful for her to withstand. The old man looked at Zen and smiled. His body is different from ours. I don't know how he cultivated this body, but it's so much stronger than an ordinary person's. He can withstand 10 shares of the blood wild bones. I see. Giacomo nodded. The old man was the most powerful warrior in the 9 Li race. His cultivation base was unfathomable and his insight was incomparable. Giacomo would be foolish not to trust his judgment. We'll all be watching, said the old man before his body melted into the shadows and disappeared from Zen's sight. After that, Giacomo took Zen through the warehouses where Zen noticed several cracks that emitted wild god power. Around each crack, more than 10 people were busy extracting the wild god power from the wild bones. However, none of them absorbed the wild god power. Instead, they guided the flow of the wild god power into the cracks. Zen was puzzled. What were they doing? This is the cave of wildness and wild god power can't escape from it, explained Giacomo after seeing Zen's expression. Romeo, Elsa, and Killian are cultivating in the cave and they need a lot of wild god power. That's why these people are extracting the wild god power and injecting it into the cave. Really? That's amazing, Zen exclaimed. It was indeed not a difficult thing to extract the wild god power from the wild bones. Even an ordinary person could do it. There might be a slight difference in the methods, but these methods were all useful. Zen didn't expect that the geniuses of 9 Li race had such privileges. They didn't even need to extract the wild god power from wild bones themselves. When Zen and Giacomo were close enough, one of the men walked over to them and bowed his head in greeting. Elder Giacomo. Giacomo nodded in regard. Baldwin, I have new orders. Ask Doran to leave the cave. Baldwin looked up with a start, unsure if he had heard right. He glanced at Zen before turning to Giacomo, conflicted. I don't think it's appropriate to do this, Elder Giacomo. If we do, Elder Celia would surely get angry with us. After Chandler's and Farhan's deaths, the 9 Li race had chosen 2 other men to fight for the race. One of them was Doran, whose mother was Elder Celia. In this period of time, they invested all of the race's resources in these 5 young warriors. This was why Doran was trying his best to cultivate. It was a great opportunity and he wanted to make everyone proud. But now Giacomo wanted him to pull out. Giacomo's face darkened at Baldwin's words. Do as I say. Nodding meekly, Baldwin said nothing more and walked away. He was curious about the young man standing beside Giacomo. He had never seen that man before, but he must be important if he was going to replace Doran. Under Giacomo's command, Baldwin ordered the people to halt the extraction of wild god power before he entered the cave. In the depths, a young man in black was sitting cross-legged, continuously absorbing wild god power. It was Doran, and when he saw Baldwin coming in, he frowned. Baldwin, what are you doing here? Elder Giacomo asked you to leave the cave. You're being replaced by someone else. What? Doran's face darkened as he stood abruptly. Why? Baldwin shook his head. You can ask Elder Giacomo in person. The purity of Doran's blood was also 5th grade, but when it came to talent, he was slightly weaker than Romeo and others. He had never had a chance to prove himself. Farhan and Chandler were dead, and it was his turn now to fight for the 9 Li race. He had been ecstatic when he was chosen to fight and he valued this rare opportunity greatly. They didn't expect him to just leave so calmly, did they? Stomping out of the cave, Doran angrily marched straight to Giacomo. Giacomo, what are you doing? Asked Doran, his teeth clenched and skin white with anger. His mother, Elder Celia, held a high position in the 9 Li race and was even stronger than Giacomo. He would have some manners when he met Giacomo in normal times, but at this moment, he was bearing a grudge and called Giacomo by his name. The plan has changed and someone else is to take your place inside the cave, Giacomo replied calmly. While he did not expect this level of anger from Doran, he was unfazed by it. Someone else? I know every member of the 9 Li race. Who else is more qualified than me? Doran asked coldly before his gaze shifted to Zen. Are you talking about him? Yes, answered Giacomo. I am. He's a member of our race. Doran looked Zen up and down. He couldn't remember anyone like him in the 9 Li race. Their argument immediately attracted the others' attention. Meanwhile, Romeo came out of another cave and noticed Zen standing not far away from him. A smile appeared on his face as he walked up to him. Hi, Zen, you're here. Have you accepted the blood of our race already? After Romeo went back to the bone tower of the 9 Li race, he told the elders about Zen. According to the original plan, they would give Zen Chiyu's blood so that he could be a member of their race. The acquired blood was weaker than the blood born with, but Zen himself was powerful enough, which would make up for it. However, getting the blood transfusion would take some time, and Romeo was curious why Zen was sent to the Cave of Wildness so soon. A foreigner with the blood transfusion wants to squeeze me out of the Cave of Wildness. Why? Hearing Romeo's words, Doran became even more furious. Competing with Zen only smeared his reputation.